Welcome, dear friends, to Saints for Sleeping. Tonight, as darkness envelops the world and the stars twinkle overhead, I invite you on an extraordinary journey. A journey not only through time, but into the depths of silence, to those sacred places where the soul finds its true rest. Imagine for a moment the hills of Italy at sunset. The sun dips behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. In the distance, the soft tolling of a bell can be heard. It is Vespers, the evening prayer. The monks walk in single file, their black habits gently brushing against the ancient stones of the cloister. Their steps are measured, serene, as if each movement were a prayer in itself. This is the world we will explore together tonight. The world of Saint Benedict of Nursia, the father of Western monasticism, the man who taught us that God is found in silence and peace. Breathe deeply with me. Let your bodies sink into the comfort of where you are resting. Allow the worries of the day to dissolve like mist in the morning sun. The story I'm about to tell you happened more than 1400 years ago, but its echoes resonate to this day. It's a story of searching, of chosen solitude, of found community. It's the story of a man who fled the noise of the world to find God's voice in silence. And in doing so, he changed the course of Western history, preserved civilization, and left us a path to inner peace that remains relevant in our busy times. Benito's world, Italy, in times of shadow. To truly understand Saint Benedict, we must first understand the world into which he was born. It was around the year 480 AD. The Roman Empire, that colossal structure that had dominated the known world for centuries, was crumbling like an ancient building whose columns finally give way under their own weight. The Roman roads, once throbbing with the passage of marching legions and merchants transporting their goods, now witnessed hordes of barbarian peoples. The Goths, the Vandals, the Huns. All these names that had once been distant whispers of threat were now immediate and terrifying realities. Rome itself, the Eternal City, had been sacked in 410 AD by Alaric and his Visigoths. Imagine the shock, the absolute terror of that moment. It was as if the sun itself had ceased to shine. In Italy, life had become precarious. Cities, once thriving on trade and culture, were now emptying out. People fled to the countryside, seeking safety in small, fortified villages. The knowledge accumulated over centuries, preserved in libraries and schools, was in danger of being lost forever. Books were burned, buildings crumbled, and darkness seemed to be swallowing everything. But in the midst of this darkness, something extraordinary was happening. The Christian faith, which had been legalized only 150 years earlier, was taking deep root. Churches were multiplying. Bishops were becoming the leaders of cities, assuming roles that had once belonged to Roman officials. And in secluded places, far from the chaos, men and women were seeking God in solitude. Monasticism already existed. From Egypt and Syria had come astonishing tales of the Desert Fathers, those holy men who withdrew to the desert to fight demons and find God in the burning emptiness of the sands. Anthony the Great, Pachomius, the two Macarii, these names resonated with an almost mythical power. They were the athletes of God, as some called them, training their souls in the most rigorous discipline. But the monasticism that reached the West was sometimes chaotic, lacking a clear structure. Some hermits lived in caves, barely surviving on roots and herbs. Others formed communities, but without clear rules, leading to confusion and, at times, excesses. There were those who competed in extreme austerities, as if holiness could be measured by how much one could punish one's body. Something was missing: balance, wisdom, a clear path that could be followed not only by exceptional spiritual heroes, but by ordinary people who sincerely sought God. This was the world waiting for Benedict, a world in desperate need of peace, order, and light. And from the hills of Nursia, in the heart of Italy, that light was about to emerge. Nursia, the birth of the saint. In the Umbria region, surrounded by mountains that rise majestically towards the sky, lies Nursia. Today we know this place as Nursia, a charming village of cobbled streets and stone houses, where time seems to slow down. Around the year 480, a child was born in this village who would change the world. They named him Benedict, which means blessed, a prophetic name, as it would turn out. Benedict was born into a noble family. His father was a man of position, probably a Roman official still trying to maintain order in a world that was falling apart. They owned land, they had influence, they had that relative security that money and status could provide even in difficult. Benedict had a twin sister, Scholastica, a poignant detail that reminds us that even the greatest saints come from families, have siblings, and are part of the ordinary fabric of human life. Imagine these two children growing up together in Nursia. The Apennine Mountains rise around the valley, their peaks often snow-capped even in spring. Summers are warm and golden, filled with the song of cicadas. Winters are cold and silent, with smoke from chimneys rising straight into the clear sky. It is a land of austere beauty, where nature teaches lessons of resilience and humility. Benedict's childhood, as far as we know, was relatively peaceful. He grew up in a Christian home, where faith was not just a series of rituals, but a way of life. He learned to read and write, rare skills in those times, reserved for the privileged. He studied the scriptures, and from an early age, he seems to have shown an inclination towards spiritual matters. But he was also a normal child. He played, explored the hills, and perhaps helped with household chores. However, there was something different about Benito. Those who knew him noticed a certain seriousness about him, an early maturity. While other children were content with games and mischief, Benito seemed to be listening to something deeper, something calling from beyond the mountain. When he reached the appropriate age, his parents, with the best of intentions and high hopes for his future, sent him to Rome to complete his education. Rome, despite its decline, was still the center of the world, the place where an ambitious young man could make connections, learn rhetoric and law, and perhaps forge a career in administration or the church. It was an honor to be sent there, an opportunity many longed for. So, Benedict left the peaceful mountains of Nursia and traveled south to the great city. He was accompanied by his nurse, a faithful woman who had cared for him since childhood and who would now travel with him to ensure he was well settled in the city. The journey on horseback or by cart would have taken several days, following the ancient Roman roads that were still in use, though they showed signs of disrepair. What did Benito feel when he first saw the walls of Rome rising before him? Awe? Excitement? Or perhaps even then, a certain apprehension, a feeling that this noisy, busy place was not where his heart would find its home. Rome, the call that arises from the noise. Rome in the 5th century was a city of stark contrasts. On the one hand, it still retained vestiges of its former glory. Aqueducts continued to bring fresh water to the public fountain. The Colosseum, though no longer used for bloody games, stood as a reminder of a power it once held. Christian basilicas, built on or alongside pagan temples, proclaimed the triumph of the new faith. But on the other hand, Rome was a city in decline. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned, their buildings crumbling to pieces. The population, which had once exceeded 1 million, was now a fraction of that. Romans, Goths, Greeks, and Syrians mingled in the streets, all speaking a babel of languages. There were beggars on every corner. Violence was not uncommon, and in the schools and universities where Benito was to study, there was an atmosphere that the young man from the mountains found deeply disturbing. The students in Rome were not like him. Many came from wealthy and powerful families, and they used their time in the city not to learn, but to indulge in pleasure. There were wild parties, immoral relationships, and an obsession with luxury and status that clashed violently with the values Benedict had absorbed in his pious home in Nursia. Our principal biographer of Saint Benedict, Pope Gregory the Great, who wrote about him barely 50 years after his death, tells us that Benedict observed all this with growing horror. He saw his companions sinking into vice, he heard them mocking virtue and chastity, and he made a decision that would change his life and the lives of countless people after him. He decided to flee. It was not a decision taken lightly. It meant abandoning the opportunity for a brilliant career, disappointing his parents, and giving up all the advantages his birth had. But Benedict saw with crystal clarity that if he remained in Rome, if he tried to adapt to that culture of superficiality and sin, he would lose something infinitely more valuable than any earthly position. He would lose his soul. St. Gregory tells us that Benedict withdrew, wisely ignorant and wisely illiterate. It is a paradoxical statement that requires reflection. Benedict was not ignorant in the ordinary sense. He had received an education. He could read and write. He knew the scriptures, but he chose to distance himself from the kind of knowledge that Rome offered, that worldly knowledge which often leads away from God instead of drawing us closer to Him. He preferred the simple wisdom of the gospel to the hollow sophistication of pagan rhetoric. One night, without saying a word to anyone except his faithful nurse, Benedict simply left. He left Rome like someone fleeing a burning house. He walked east, toward the mountains, toward the silence. He had no clear plan beyond getting away from the noise and seeking God. He trusted that the path would reveal itself as he walked it. His wet nurse, that loyal woman whose name we do not know but whose devotion shines through the ages, followed him. She could not abandon the child she had cared for, even though he was no longer a child, but a young man of about 20. They travelled together and finally arrived at a place called Enfide, now known as Enfide, a small town about 50 kilometers east of Rome. There they stayed near the Church of St. Peter, welcomed by the charity of the small Christian community. And it was there, in Enfide, that the first miracle associated with Benedict occurred, a humble but profound miracle, the miracle of the broken sieve, signs of destiny. Benito's wet nurse, wanting to be helpful and perhaps justify her presence there, had borrowed a ceramic sieve for cleaning wheat from the village women. It was a common household utensil, but valuable to people of modest means. While she was using it, it accidentally slipped from her hands and fell to the ground, breaking in 2 pieces. The poor woman was devastated. She wept bitterly, not so much over the sieve itself, but from the shame of having broken something borrowed, from the humiliation of being seen as careless. In those times and places, where everyone knew each other and reputation was everything, such an incident could become a source of gossip and ostracism. Seeing the pain of this woman who had cared for him with such love, Benito felt deep compassion. He knelt down, picked up the 2 pieces of the broken sieve, and began to pray. He prayed with such intensity, with such faith, that something extraordinary happened. The broken pieces joined together again. The sieve was completely restored, without a visible crack, as if it had never been broken. It is a simple, even domestic miracle. There is no fire from heaven, no earthquake, no sea parts, no dead are raised. And yet, in its simplicity, lies its beauty and its message. God cares about small things. He cares about the distress of a humble woman. He cares about a broken ceramic sieve. Nothing is too insignificant for his love and his power. But this miracle had a consequence that Benedict had not foreseen. The news spread through Enfide like wildfire. People began to talk about the young saint, the miracle worker. They came to see him, to touch him, to ask him to pray for them. The restored sieve was hung in the Church of St. Peter as a relic, where it remained for centuries, becoming an object of veneration. For Benedict, this was a nightmare. He had fled Rome seeking silence and solitude, and now he found himself in the spotlight, a local celebrity. People praised him, spoke of his holiness, and Benedict, with profound humility and keen spiritual discernment, recognized the danger. Human praise can be more dangerous than persecution. Pride can creep in disguised as admiration. And he had come here precisely to escape the temptations of the world. So one night, without saying a word to anyone, not even his nurse, Benito left. He simply vanished into the darkness. He left behind the comforts of the village, the admiration of the people, even the woman who had raised him. It must have been a moment of profound loneliness and determination. Benito walked toward the mountains, into the unknown, guided only by his burning desire to find God. He walked for hours, perhaps days, along rocky and treacherous mountain paths. The mountains of Subiaco are rugged and wild. Cliffs drop abruptly into deep valleys. The forests are dense, inhabited by wolves and wild boars. There were no clear roads, no inns where he could rest. Benito carried little with him, perhaps only a cloak and some bread. And then, in the most remote part of those mountains, in a place called Subiaco, he found what he was looking for. Or rather, what he was looking for found him. Subiaco, the Cave of Silence. Subiaco Valley takes its name from the Latin sublacum, meaning under the lake. Centuries earlier, Emperor Nero had built a magnificent summer villa there, complete with artificial gardens fed by a lake created by damming the Anio River. By Benedict's time, all of it was in ruins. Nero's villa had collapsed, the lake had drained, and the place had reverted to its natural state of wild beauty. It was a landscape of craggy rocks, deep ravines, and the Anio River winding its way among the stones. Oak and chestnut forests covered the slopes. In spring, wildflowers dotted the meadows with colour. In winter, the cold penetrated to the bone, and the snow blanketed everything in a pristine silence. Benito, wandering through this landscape, found a cave. It wasn't large, barely big enough for a man to lie down in. It opened into the side of a rocky cliff, high above the valley, almost inaccessible. To reach it, one had to climb, clinging to bushes and rocky ledges. But once inside, it offered protection from the elements and, more importantly, complete solitude. Benito decided that this would be his home. Here he would seek God, far from everything and everyone. But God, in his providence, did not want Benedict to be completely alone. There was a monk in that region named Romanus. Romanus lived in a nearby monastery led by an abbot named Adeodatus. Romanus was a sincere man of God, one of those who have a special gift for discerning the promptings of the Spirit. One day, while walking in the mountains, or perhaps guided by a dream or a vision, he met Benedict. What did Romano see in this young man of barely 20, dressed in simple clothes, his face already marked by days of fasting and prayer? He saw something special, something holy, and instead of trying to persuade Benedict to return to civilization, Romano respected his calling. He promised to keep his presence a secret, to tell no one, not even his own abbot, where Benedict was. And then, he did something even more extraordinary. Romano began to feed Benito. But the cave was in such a remote and inaccessible place that he couldn't simply carry the food on foot. So he devised an ingenious system. From the monastery where he lived, which was high on the cliff above Benito's cave, Romano would lower a bit of bread tied to a rope. To let Benito know the food had arrived, Romano attached a small bell to the rope. When the bell rang, Benito would come out of his cave and collect the bread. Imagine this scene, the profound silence of the mountains, broken only by birdsong and the distant murmur of the river. Suddenly, the soft tinkling of a bell. Benito emerges from his cave like a hermit from another world, his beard growing long, his body thinned by fasting, but his eyes shining with an inner light. He gathers the bread, offers a prayer of thanksgiving to God and to the good Romano, and returns to his solitude. For 3 years, Benito lived like this. 3 years of almost complete silence. 3 years without seeing practically any human being except occasionally Romano. 3 years of prayer, fasting, spiritual struggle, and deep communion with God. What did he do during those 3 years? How did he spend his days and nights? We don't have a detailed account, but we can imagine it based on the practices of other hermits and what we know about Benedict's spirituality. He would rise at dawn, or perhaps earlier, while it was still dark. Dawn in the mountains is a sacred experience. The light filters in slowly, revealing first the outlines of the highest peaks, then gradually descending to illuminate the valley below. The birds begin their morning chorus. The air is fresh and pure, full of promise. Benito would begin his day with prayer. He would chant the Psalms, those ancient poems of praise and lament that have been the prayer of God's people for millennia. As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. Out of the depths I cry to you, Lord. Praise the Lord, my soul. The words would flow from his lips, sometimes aloud, sometimes in a whisper, becoming as much a part of the landscape as the wind in the trees or water over the stones. After morning prayer, he might have some of the bread Romano had sent him. He ate little, just enough to stay alive. Fasting was not an end in itself for him, but a means of purification, a way to make the body serve the spirit instead of dominating it. Then came the work. Even in solitude, there are things to do. Benedict would keep his cave clean and tidy. Perhaps he cultivated a small herb garden near the entrance to his cave, if the soil allowed it. He might mend his clothes by patching the tears caused by brambles. Manual labor, Benedict would discover, is also a form of prayer when done with mindfulness and gratitude. Throughout the day, she constantly returned to prayer. Not on a strict schedule as she would later have in her monastery, but in a natural flow, responding to the promptings of the Spirit. She saw a flower opening and gave thanks to the Creator. She heard the cry of a hawk and marveled at God's care for all creatures. She felt the sun on her face and remembered the light of Christ. And of course, there were temptations. The mountains might be lonely, but Benedict was not alone in a spiritual sense. The enemy of souls, the one the ancients called the devil, did not stand idly by while this young man became a saint. Battles in solitude, temptations and victories. In his biography of Benedict, St. Gregory the Great recounts with admirable candor the temptations the saint faced in his cave. He does not gloss over these episodes with a prudish silence, as if holiness meant never being tempted. On the contrary, he shows us that holiness is often forged precisely in the fire of resisted temptation. There was one temptation in particular, Gregory tells us, that was especially fierce. Benedict, we recall, was a young man, probably barely over 20 years old, when he entered his cave. He had left behind not only the comforts of the world, but also the normal possibilities of life, marriage, family, human love in its physical expression. One day, while praying or meditating, the image of a woman he had seen in Rome came to him. We don't know who she was, whether a real person or a fabricated image of temptation. But the image was vivid, alluring, unsettling. Benedict felt an intense desire rising within him, a passion of the body that threatened to overwhelm his spiritual resolve. The temptation was so strong that Benedict almost decided to leave his cave and return to the world. Almost. He stood up, preparing to leave. But then something stopped him. In a moment of spiritual clarity, he saw what was truly at stake. He saw that giving in to this temptation wouldn't simply mean satisfying a physical desire. It would mean betraying his calling, abandoning the path God had shown him, losing everything he had gained in these years of struggle and prayer. And so, in an act of fierce and desperate will, Benito made a dramatic decision. Brambles and nettles grew near his cave. He took off his clothes and threw himself onto these thorny plants, rolling among them until his body was covered in cuts and his skin burned terribly from the nettle sting. It may seem extreme, even disturbing. Why would anyone do such a thing? But it must be understood in context. Benedict wasn't punishing his body for being inherently evil. He was using physical pain to combat a spiritual temptation that would otherwise have overcome him. He was like a surgeon cutting away diseased flesh to save a patient's life. The physical pain of the thorns was sharp but temporary. The pain of losing his soul would have been eternal. And it worked. St. Gregory tells us that from that moment on, Benedict was never again troubled by that particular temptation. He had won a decisive victory. Years later, when he recounted this story to his monks, he would say that from that day forward, the brambles and thorns in that place miraculously blossomed into beautiful rose bushes, as a symbol of God's grace that can transform even the instruments of our suffering into beauty. But not all temptations were physical or sensual in nature. There were also more subtle temptations, more dangerous in a way because they disguised themselves as good things. There was, for example, the temptation of spiritual pride. Benedict was doing something extraordinary, living a life of heroic holiness in complete solitude. It would have been so easy for him to begin to feel special, superior to others who lived more ordinary lives. But every time that thought arose, Benedict recognized it for what it was, the enemy whispering in his ear, and he fought it by reminding himself that everything good in him came from God, that he himself was nothing, just a sinner saved by grace. There was also the temptation of despair. There were days, surely, when the loneliness weighed terribly, when the rock walls of the cave seemed to close in on him, when the silence was not peaceful but oppressive, when he wondered if God had truly called him there, or if he had simply fled like a coward from the normal responsibilities of life. In those dark moments, Benito clung to his faith. He prayed with the words of Job, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." And the darkness always passed as night gives way to dawn, and there were temptations to be distracted. The human mind, left to its own devices in solitude, can wander down 1,000 paths. Memories of the past, worries about the future, fantasies about what might have been, elaborate plans about what should be done. Benito learned to take each thought captive, to bring his mind back again and again to the present moment, to the presence of God here and now. These spiritual battles, invisible to human eyes but terribly real, shaped Benedict. They purified him as gold is purified in fire, and as he fought and triumphed, day after day, month after month, something beautiful was happening. He was being transformed. The image of God, which sin had tarnished in him as in all of us, was beginning to shine again. He was becoming what he was destined to be from all eternity. A saint. The 3 years passed. 3 years that must have seemed like an eternity at times, and at others as if they had flown by in an instant. And then, on Easter Sunday of the year that marked the end of his 3rd year in the cave, something changed. God had new plans for Benedict. The time of complete solitude was over. It was time for Benedict to leave his cave and begin the work for which these 3 years had been only preparation. The discovery, the shepherd and the saint. It was Easter Sunday, the greatest feast of Christianity, the day we celebrate the resurrection of Christ and the victory of life over death. Romano, the faithful monk who had fed Benedict all these years, had prepared a special meal for the nothing elaborate, of course, just a little more bread than usual, perhaps some cheese or eggs, small luxuries to mark the holy day. He lowered the basket with the bell, as he had done hundreds of times before. But this time, before Benito could retrieve it, something interrupted. The abbot of Romano's monastery had, for some reason, decided to summon Romano for some task at that very moment. Romano had to leave, and the food was left hanging from the rope, uncollected. Meanwhile, in another part of those mountains, a shepherd tended his flock. He was a simple, illiterate man who spent his days outdoors with the sheep and goats. That Easter day, while the sheep grazed, the shepherd wandered off a bit, exploring, perhaps searching for fresh pasture, or simply enjoying the beautiful spring day. And then he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. On the side of a cliff, almost hidden among the rocks, was a cave, and at the entrance of the cave, sitting on a flat rock, was a figure that barely seemed human. He was wrapped in animal skins, because his original clothes had long since disintegrated. His hair and beard had grown long and matted. His body was thin, almost skeletal. But there was something in his face, in his eyes, that radiated a light the shepherd had never seen in any human being. The shepherd, overcoming his initial shock and fear, approached cautiously. Benito, seeing another human being for the first time in 3 years, apart from Romano, must have felt a mixture of emotions: surprise, joy, perhaps even a little annoyance at having his solitude interrupted. But when the shepherd drew close enough to speak, Benito saw genuine kindness in his simple, open face. Once the shepherd realized that this strange man was not a spirit or a demon but a real person, he felt immense compassion. He offered him some of his own food, probably bread and cheese he had with him. And then, In that encounter between the learned saint and the unlettered shepherd, something beautiful happened. They talked. The shepherd, with the simple wisdom of one who lives close to nature, recognized in Benedict a man of God. Benedict, with his humility and charity, treated the shepherd not with condescension, but with genuine affection and respect. When the shepherd left, he promised to return, and he kept his promise. He began to visit Benito regularly, bringing him small gifts of food, but more importantly, bringing news of the outside world. He told him about the changing seasons, about the lambs born in spring, about the winter storms. And in return, Benito spoke to him about God, taught him simple prayers, and explained the scriptures in language the shepherd could understand. This shepherd, whose name we don't know, became Benedict's first disciple, the first of thousands to come, and he couldn't keep the secret. He began to talk to other shepherds, to the people of the nearby villages. There is a saint in the mountains, he would say, a man of God who lives in a cave and shines with heavenly light. The news spread, and soon the silence that Benito had sought and cherished for 3 years began to be broken more frequently. People came to see him. They came with their problems, their illnesses, their doubts, and their sins. They came seeking advice, seeking prayer, seeking a little of the peace they saw in Benito. And Benito, though part of him longed for the absolute silence of his early years in the cave, recognized that this too came from God. He had learned in solitude that love for God cannot be separated from love for one's neighbor. If these people came to him seeking help, he could not turn them away. That would not be holiness, but spiritual selfishness. So he received visitors. He listened to their problems with infinite patience. He prayed for the sick, and many were healed. He counseled the confused, and they found clarity. He comforted the afflicted, and they received peace. And although this meant less time for his own solitary prayer, Benedict discovered something wonderful: that serving others in the name of Christ is itself a form of prayer, perhaps the highest. Miracles began to multiply. One day, a monk from a nearby monastery fell gravely ill. The brothers, having heard of Benedict, brought him to him. Benedict prayed, and the monk instantly recovered. Another time, a father brought his son who had been crushed by a falling wall. The child appeared to be dead, but Benedict prayed over him, and the child rose completely healed, without a mark on his body. These were not tricks or illusions. They were genuine signs of God's power working through a man who had emptied himself to be filled with the divine. And each miracle drew more people. Benito's cave, that place of solitude, was becoming a place of pilgrimage. It was then that a group of monks from a nearby monastery came to Benedict with a surprising request. Their abbot had recently died, and the monastery was in disarray. They needed a leader, someone with spiritual authority and wisdom. They had heard of Benedict, of his holiness and his miracles. Would he become their abbot? Benedict resisted. He knew his own heart and how much he valued solitude. He also knew the difficulties of leadership, the temptations of power, the complexities of community life. But the monks persisted. They begged him. And finally, perhaps against his better judgment, Benedict agreed. It was a decision that almost cost him his life, but one that would teach valuable lessons to him and to generation after generation of monks after him. The first community, lessons from failure. The monastery to which Benedict was called was in Vicovaro, not far from Subiaco. It was a community of monks who, in theory, lived according to the Christian principles of prayer, work, and communal life. But the reality was very different. These monks had grown accustomed to a relaxed life. Yes, they prayed, but without much fervour. Yes, they worked, but without real discipline. And as for communal life, each one basically did as he pleased. The monastery functioned more like a boarding house where men lived side by side than a true spiritual community. They had called on Benedict because, in a moment of crisis following the death of their abbot, they recognized that they needed to change. But recognizing it in theory is one thing. Being willing to make the necessary sacrifices for change is quite another. Benedict arrived at the monastery with hope and determination. He established a regular schedule of prayers. He insisted that everyone participate in manual labor. He set rules about food, limiting excesses. He spoke about obedience, humility, and contemplative silence. In other words, he tried to introduce exactly the kind of discipline and order he had learned to value in his cave. The monks hated him. At first they tried to comply, but soon resentment began to grow. This young man, barely 30 years old, coming from his cave in the mountains, who did he think he was to tell them how to live? They had been monks since before he was born. They had developed their customs, their way of doing things. Why did they have to change now? Resentment turned into murmurs. The murmurs turned into conspiracy. And the conspiracy turned into something horrible. They decided to kill Benito. It was a simple but effective plan. Benedict, as abbot, blessed the wine before meals. The monks put poison in the chalice of wine they would offer Benedict to bless. When he drank from that wine after blessing it, he would die, and they could return to their comfortable, uncomplicated life. Lunchtime arrived. They brought the poisoned wine to Benedict. He, suspecting nothing, raised the chalice and made the sign of the cross over it to bless it, as was his custom. And then something extraordinary happened. The chalice shattered. It simply broke into pieces in his hand as if struck by a stone. The wine spilled onto the table, and with it, the poison. Benedict stared at the broken chalice, then at the monks gathered around, and in an instant of devastating clarity, he understood what had happened. He did not become enraged. He did not accuse or threaten them. He simply stood up, removed his abbot's robes, and said to them calmly and without bitterness, "May Almighty God have mercy on you. Did I not tell you from the beginning that my ways and yours would not agree? Go and find an abbot who suits your way of life, for I can no longer remain with you." And he left. He returned to his cave in Subiaco, to the silence he loved so much. Some might think this was a failure. Certainly, the monks of Vicovaro did not benefit from Benedict's presence, at least not at that time. But for Benedict himself, this experience was invaluable. He learned that not everyone is ready for the serious spiritual life he valued. He learned that trying to force unwilling people to change only leads to frustration and conflict. He learned that a true spiritual leader needs not only personal holiness, but also discernment about whom to call and how to form a community. And he learned something perhaps even more important, that failure is not the end. God can use even our failures to teach us and prepare us for greater successes. The Benito who returned to his cave in Subiaco was wiser than the one who had left. He was better prepared for the work God truly had for him. For although Benedict had returned to his cave, he would not be alone for long. The seeds he had planted during his time outside the cave were about to bear fruit. Young men, genuinely hungry for God, genuinely willing to embrace the discipline and sacrifice that the spiritual life requires, began to come to him. The birth of the 12 monasteries. Back in his cave, Benedict resumed his life of prayer and solitude. But now things were different. People knew where he was. His reputation for holiness had spread throughout the region, and young men began to arrive, one by one at first, then in small groups, seeking to become his disciple. These were not like the monks of Vicovaro. These men came with open hearts and hungry spirits. They wanted to learn. They were willing to change. Many came from noble families in Rome, young men who, like Benedict himself years before, had seen the decline of society and wanted something better, something more authentic. Benedict did not reject them, but neither did he simply accept them without question. He tested them first. He made them wait, observing their patience. He gave them difficult tasks, gauging their willingness to obey. He spoke to them about the hardships of monastic life, the sacrifices required. He wanted to be sure they knew what they were getting into. And those who passed these initial tests, those who showed genuine sincerity and perseverance, were welcomed. Benedict assigned them places to live near his cave. He taught them to pray, to work, to live in community. And gradually, naturally, a community began to form. But soon, the cave became too small. There were too many disciples. They needed more space, more structure. And so Benedict, with the help of wealthy benefactors who admired his work, began to establish small monasteries in the Subiaco area. He founded 12 monasteries in total, each with 12 monks, reflecting Christ and his 12 apostles. The monasteries were scattered throughout the valley, each in its own location, but all following the same basic rules that Benedict established. And Benedict himself, although he kept his cave as his special place of retreat, travelled between the monasteries, teaching, overseeing, correcting when necessary, and always encouraging. The days in these monasteries followed a beautiful and orderly rhythm. They rose early, before dawn, for morning prayers. They chanted psalms together, their voices blending in harmony, offering the first hours of the day to God. Afterward came a time of spiritual reading. Each monk had access to the already written scriptures of the Church Fathers. In an age when books were rare and precious, this was an extraordinary luxury. Then, after a simple breakfast, came the work. And here Benito insisted on something revolutionary for his time. Everyone worked with their hands. It didn't matter if you came from a noble family accustomed to being served. Here you dug in the garden, carried water, repaired buildings, cooked and cleaned. It was a beautiful night, one of those nights that shine in memory like jewels. The storm raged outside, but inside there was peace, warmth, and brotherly love in its purest form. They talked until the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows. Then, and only then, did the storm begin to subside. Benedict and Scholastica said their goodbyes. He returned to Monte Cassino, she to her convent. 3 days later, Benedict was in his cell when he had a vision. He saw his sister's soul ascending to heaven in the form of a dove, flying straight to eternal glory. Scholastica had died. She had departed this world peacefully, surrounded by her sisters, and God had allowed Benedict to witness her triumph, to see her soul freed from her body and flying to its true home. Benedict sent his brothers to the monastery to bring Scholastica's body, and he buried her at Monte Cassino, in the tomb he himself had prepared for himself. For, he said, those who had been so united in life by their service to God should not be separated in death. They would be together, awaiting the resurrection. This story of Benedict and Scholastica teaches us many things. It teaches us about brotherly love, about how even saints do not lose their natural affections, but purify and elevate them. It teaches us about the power of prayer, about how God hears even the simplest requests when they come from a pure heart. It teaches us that there are times when the spirit of the law is more important than the letter, when rules must yield to love. And it teaches us something about divine priority. Benedict was concerned with the rule, with obligations, with doing what was right according to monastic standards. But God showed, through that miraculous storm, that brotherly love, especially when that love is lived in God, is more precious than any rule. The rule exists to serve love, not the other way around. The last days, preparing for departure. After Scholastica's death, Benedict knew his own time was approaching. He was already an old man, probably in his 60s, which was a very advanced age in those times. His body, weakened by years of fasting and hard work, was beginning to fail. But his spirit remained strong. In the last months of his life, he worked with renewed urgency to ensure that everything was in order. He wanted his monks to be prepared to carry on without him. He reviewed the rule, making sure that everything was clear. He appointed capable leaders for the various aspects of monastery life. He spoke with each monk individually, offering them words of encouragement and advice, and he prayed. He prayed more than ever, if that was possible. He spent long hours in the chapel, often alone, his face glowing with a light that seemed otherworldly. The monks who saw him noticed something different about him, as if a part of him was already in heaven while his body was still on earth. There was an occasion, shortly before his death, when some of his monks found him levitating during prayer. He wasn't standing, he was suspended in the air, wrapped in mystical ecstasy. The monks stood motionless, afraid to interrupt. When Benedict finally regained his senses and his feet touched the ground again, he asked them not to say anything about what they had seen until after his death. He did not want to be an object of admiration or curiosity. On another occasion, one of the nobles of the region came to see Benito. He was an important man, accustomed to being treated with deference, but when he entered Benito's cell, something strange happened. Suddenly, he lost the ability to speak. He stood there, his mouth open, unable to utter a sound. Benedict looked at him with compassion. It wasn't that the saint had done anything wrong. It was simply that God's presence around Benedict was so intense that this man, accustomed to worldliness, couldn't bear it. Benedict prayed for him, and the man regained his speech. But he left there completely changed. Whatever he had come to say no longer seemed important. He had experienced something of God's power, and it had transformed him. 6 days before his death, Benedict ordered his monks to open his tomb, the tomb where Scholastica's body already rested. It was a clear sign that he knew his time had come. The monks obeyed with heavy hearts. They opened the tomb and prepared it. Then, 4 days before he died, Benedict fell gravely ill. He had a high fever. His weak body was finally giving way. But his mind remained clear, his spirit peaceful. He asked to be taken to the chapel. He wanted to be near the altar, near the place of Christ's real presence in the Eucharist, during his last hours. The monks gently carried him and placed him where he could see the altar. And there he remained, praying constantly, his weak voice murmuring the words of the Psalms he had recited thousands of times throughout his life. On the day of his death, March 21st, 547, Benedict asked for Holy Communion. He received the body and blood of Christ with profound devotion, tears streaming down his aged face. It was his last communion on this earth, but he knew that soon he would be in the presence of Christ himself, not under the veils of the sacrament, but face to face. After receiving communion, Benedict asked his brothers to help him to his feet. He did not want to die lying down. He wanted to die in prayer. The monks, now openly weeping, supported him. Benedict raised his frail hands toward heaven and began to pray aloud. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," he prayed, echoing the words of Christ on the cross. And then, held by the loving hands of his brothers, his last breath of prayer, Benedict died. The monks later said that at the moment of his death, they saw something extraordinary. They saw a brilliant light, brighter than the sun, filling the chapel. And in the midst of that light, they saw the path leading from heaven to earth, like a glorious carpet spread from on high, and angels descending along that path, carrying Benedict's soul upward, toward paradise. 2 monks, one in a distant monastery and the other on his way to Monte Cassino, had the same vision at the same time. Both saw the path of light. Both saw angels carrying a soul to heaven. When they met later and compared their visions, they realized they had witnessed Benedict's entry into eternal glory. The legacy. The seed that became a forest. Benedict's death could have been the end of the story, but in reality, it was only the beginning. The seed that had been planted in that cave in Subiaco so many years before, that had grown in the 12 monasteries and then at Monte Cassino, that had been codified in the rule. That seed was about to become a forest that would cover Europe. The monks of Monte Cassino continued their father's work. They lived according to his rule, praying and working, keeping alive the spirit he had instilled in them. And others, hearing about Benedict and his way of life, came to see. Some stayed, becoming Benedictines themselves. Others returned to their own places and founded monasteries according to the Benedictine model. In Italy, France, Spain, Germany, and England, Benedictine monasteries began to multiply. Each was autonomous, governed by its own abbot, but all followed the same rule. And in each of these monasteries, the rhythm of prayer and work, the balance of solitude and community, the blend of discipline and mercy that Benedict had established, created an oasis of order and peace. Benedictine monasteries became centers of learning at a time when knowledge was in danger of being lost. In their scriptoria, the writing rooms where monks copied books, not only the scriptures and Christian writings were preserved, but also the classics of Latin and Greek literature, Virgil, Cicero, the ancient philosophers. All survived the Dark Ages because Benedictine monks patiently copied them by hand, letter by letter. Imagine the scene, a scriptorium in a Benedictine monastery in the dead of winter. It's cold. The monks' fingers are numb, even in fingerless gloves. The light is dim, just candles and perhaps some grey light filtering through the narrow windows. The monk sits at his slanted desk, quill pen in hand, inkwell beside him. In front of him is the ancient manuscript he is copying, its pages yellowed and fragile. And next to it, the new parchment on which he is writing his copy. It is tedious, exhausting work. One mistake means scraping the parchment and starting all over again. The hours pass slowly, but the monk perseveres, because he knows he is doing something important. He is preserving knowledge for future generations. He is being true to the spirit of Benedict, who valued both intellectual and manual labor, and when he finishes a page, he decorates it. He draws beautiful illustrations in the margins, elaborate capital letters at the beginning of chapters. He transforms the book into a work of art as well as a vehicle for knowledge. Because for these monks, everything done for the glory of God must be done to the best of its ability. Benedictine monasteries also became centers of agriculture and technological development. The monks drained swamps and transformed them into fertile land. They built watermills to grind grain. They developed new farming techniques. They raised sheep and made cheese. And they shared this knowledge with local farmers, raising the standard of living for entire communities. They established schools where children, not only those destined for monastic life, but also those who would remain in the world, could learn to read and write. In an era when education was rare, Benedictine monasteries made it accessible. They maintained inns where travelers could find safe haven. In a world where travel was dangerous, where bandits lurked on the roads and inns were often dens of vice, monasteries offered safe and respectable places of rest. They cared for the sick. Each monastery had its own infirmary where sick monks were treated, but they also opened their doors to the sick from outside. They developed knowledge of medicinal herbs and healing techniques. They weren't doctors in the modern sense, but in a time without hospitals, they did what they could. And above all, they maintained constant prayer. 7 times a day, and again at night, the monastery bells called the monks to prayer. And their prayer wasn't just for themselves. They prayed for the church, for the pope, for kings and rulers, for peace, for the sick, for the dead, for everyone. They saw prayer as their primary work, their most important contribution to society. A bishop once asked a Benedictine abbot, "What do you monks do? I see you pray a lot, but what good is that to the world?" The abbot replied, "Father, we maintain the walls." "What walls?" asked the puzzled bishop. "The walls between order and chaos, between civilization and barbarism, between light and darkness. We maintain them with our prayer." And he was right. Benedictine monasteries were islands of stability in a sea of chaos. While kingdoms rose and fell, while invasions swept across Europe, while violence and ignorance seemed to triumph, the monasteries remained, praying and working, preserving and teaching, beacons of hope. Benedictine saints, fruits of the tree of Benedict. Countless saints emerged from the Benedictine family. Men and women who, following the rule of Benedict, reached extraordinary heights of holiness. Mentioning just a few of them gives us an idea of the spiritual richness of this tradition. Saint Gregory the Great, the Pope who wrote Benedict's biography barely 50 years after his death, was himself a Benedictine monk. Before being elected Pope, he had converted his family palace into a monastery and lived there as a simple monk. And even as Pope, he continued to live according to Benedictine principles as much as possible. St. Augustine of Canterbury, sent by Gregory the Great to convert England to Christianity, was a Benedictine monk. He brought the Catholic faith and the rule of Benedict to England, establishing the monastery of Canterbury, which would become the centre of the English Church. St. Boniface, the Apostle of Germany, was a Benedictine monk from England, who crossed the sea to evangelize the Germanic tribes. He founded monasteries throughout Germany, translated the scriptures into German, and was eventually martyred for his faith. His tomb in Fulda became one of the great pilgrimage sites of the Middle Ages. The Venerable Bede, the great historian and scholar, spent his entire life at the Benedictine Monastery of Jarrow in northern England. There he wrote his ecclesiastical history of the English people, which remains our primary source for the early history of England. He was a man who never travelled more than a few miles from his monastery, yet whose mind encompassed all of known history. Saint Hildegard of Bingen, in the 12th century, was a German Benedictine nun who was a mystic, prophetess, physician, composer, and writer. Her visions were recognized by the popes of her time. Her music, composed almost 1,000 years ago, is still heard today. Her writings on medicine and botany were advanced for her era. She was one of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages, all rooted in her Benedictine life of prayer and work. And there were thousands, tens of thousands more, whose names we do not know. Ordinary monks and nuns who lived faithfully according to the rule, who prayed faithfully, who worked faithfully, who loved God and neighbor faithfully. They did not perform spectacular miracles. They did not write famous books. They did not found churches or nations. But in their quiet faithfulness, in their perseverance day after day, year after year, they too were saints, and they too were fruits of the tree planted by Benedict. The Benedictine family would eventually diversify. Reformed branches would emerge, such as the Cistercians in the 12th century, seeking a return to the original simplicity of the rule. The Trappists, an even stricter branch of the Cistercians, would live in near-complete silence, cultivating the land and making products like the famous Trappist cheese. But all of them, in their different forms, traced their origins back to Benedict and his rule. Benedict, in modern times, a perennial message. We might think that Benedict, who lived 1,500 years ago, would have little to say to us today. After all, we live in such a different world from his. We have technology he could never have imagined. We live in democracies, not barbarian kingdoms. Most of us are not monks, nor do we want to be. But the truth is, Benedict's message is surprisingly relevant to our time, perhaps more than ever. We live in an age of constant noise, of incessant distraction. Our phones buzz with notifications. Our minds jump from one thing to another, unable to concentrate. We are constantly connected, but often feel profoundly alone. We have access to more information than any previous generation, but frequently lack wisdom. In this context, the Benedictine life offers something we desperately need: rhythm, balance, silence, genuine community, and a sense of purpose beyond consumption and entertainment. The rhythm of prayer that marks the hours of the Benedictine day teaches us to experience time differently, not as something constantly slipping through our fingers, something we must anxiously save or manage, but as a gift from God to be lived fully, moment by moment. Regular pauses for prayer interrupt the frenzy, bringing us back to what truly matters. The balance between prayer and work teaches us that we are not just bodies nor just souls, but both. We need physical activity, work with our hands, not just desk jobs and screens. But we also need contemplation, time to be still, to think, to pray. A life that is all work without prayer becomes empty. A life that is all prayer without work becomes unreal. We need both. The silence that the Benedictines value so highly challenges us in our noisy culture. When was the last time we experienced true silence? Not just the absence of sound, but a profound silence of the soul, where we can hear the whispers of God, where we can know our own hearts. Benedictine monasteries, even today, offer this gift of silence to those who come seeking. Benedictine community life teaches us about commitment, about staying with people even when it's difficult, about learning to love not in the abstract, but in the challenging reality of daily life with real people, with all their quirks and flaws. In a culture of disposable relationships where we change jobs, partners, and friends with increasing ease, Benedictine stability, the promise of staying in one place with these specific people, is profoundly countercultural and deeply healing. And the fundamental purpose of Benedictine life, seeking God above all else, challenges us in our culture of materialism and secularism. What do we live for? To accumulate things, to maximize pleasure, to achieve success by worldly standards? The Benedictines answer, we live to know and love God, and in knowing and loving Him, we find our true fulfillment. Today there are still hundreds of active Benedictine monasteries around the world. In Europe, in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia, Benedictine monks and nuns continue to live according to the rule written by Benedict 15 centuries ago. They rise in the night to pray, work with their hands, receive guests, and maintain a rhythm of prayer and work. And their lives, seemingly so far removed from real life, actually touch and transform thousands of lives. People come to monasteries for retreats, seeking peace amidst their busy lives. They arrive wounded, confused, and exhausted, and they find healing in the silence and rhythm of the monastery. They participate in the monks' prayers, even if only for a few days. They eat simple meals in silence. They walk through the cloisters. They speak with a wise monk. And they leave transformed, with a renewed clarity about what truly matters. Some, after experiencing monastic life in retreat, feel a calling to something more permanent. They become Benedictine oblates, lay people who, while living in the world, promise to follow the rule of Benedict as best they can in their circumstances. They commit themselves to daily prayer, lectio divina, and to living according to the Benedictine principles of hospitality, humility, and balance. There are also ecumenical communities inspired by Benedict. The Taizé community in France, while not formally Benedictine, follows similar principles of communal prayer, work, and simplicity. It has attracted millions of young people from around the world, showing that even in the 21st century, there is a hunger for the kind of life Benedict offered. In 1964, Pope Paul VI declared Saint Benedict the Patron Saint of Europe. This was an acknowledgement that Benedictine values, balance, openness to culture while remaining faithful to Christ, hard work combined with deep contemplation, had shaped Europe in fundamental ways. And the Pope suggested that these same values could be key to Europe's future as well. Lessons for today. What Benito teaches us. As we approach the end of our journey together tonight, I want to reflect on some specific lessons we can draw from the life and teachings of Saint Benedict. Lessons we can apply to our own lives, whether we are monks or not. First, Benito teaches us about the importance of rhythm. Our culture tends toward extremes: frantic work followed by exhausted collapse, constant activity, or complete apathy. Benito shows us a middle ground, a regular rhythm, a healthy alternation of work and rest, of activity and contemplation. We are not machines to be driven non-stop until we break down. We are human beings who need natural rhythms, like the seasons, like day and night. How could we incorporate more rhythm into our lives? Perhaps by setting aside regular times for prayer, even if it's just 5 minutes in the morning and evening. Perhaps by taking a true day of rest each week, a Sabbath where we set aside work and enjoy creation and relationships. Perhaps by setting boundaries around work, not allowing it to invade every hour of every day. Second, Benedict teaches us about the value of manual labor. We increasingly live in a world of screens and desks. Our work often produces nothing tangible. At the end of the day, it's difficult to point to something and say, "I made that." Benedict insisted that his monks work with their hands, producing real things: food, buildings, tools. There is something deeply satisfying about manual labor. It connects us to the earth, to the materiality of creation. It allows us to see tangible results from our efforts. How could we incorporate more manual labor into our lives? Perhaps by cultivating a garden, even a small one. Perhaps by cooking instead of always buying prepared food. Perhaps by doing home repairs instead of always hiring someone. It's not that there's anything wrong with intellectual work. Benito valued it too. But we need both kinds of work to be whole. Third, Benedict teaches us about hospitality in an increasingly divided world. where we distrust strangers, where we shut ourselves away in our homes and closed communities, the Benedictine insistence on welcoming everyone as Christ did is radical. Who are we leaving out? Who are we ignoring? How might we practice Benedictine hospitality in our situation? Perhaps by inviting someone over for a meal, perhaps by offering help to a struggling neighbor, perhaps by being kind to the stranger, the immigrant, the different one. Hospitality costs. It costs time, energy, resources. It makes us vulnerable. But it also opens us to grace because, as Benedict taught, in the stranger, we might be receiving Christ himself. Fourth, Benedict teaches us about humility. Our culture values self-confidence, self-promotion, and assertiveness. We are constantly told that we must believe in ourselves, promote our personal brand, and strive for success. Benedict, on the other hand, places humility at the heart of the spiritual life. But Benedictine humility is not about self-hatred or pretending we have no gifts. It is about seeing the truth clearly, that all the good in us comes from God, that we are dependent creatures, that we need others and God. And in that truth lies tremendous freedom. Freed from the need to constantly prove ourselves, to be better than others, to maintain an image, we can simply be who we are, with our gifts and our limitations, and rest in God's love. How do we practice humility? Perhaps by admitting when we're wrong instead of defending ourselves. Perhaps by asking for help when we need it, instead of pretending we can do everything alone. Perhaps by being genuinely happy for the success of others instead of feeling envious. Small acts, but transformative. Fifth, Benedict teaches us about perseverance. Stability is one of the Benedictine vows, the promise to remain in one place with these specific people through whatever comes. In a culture of endless choices, where we can always switch to something new if things get tough, this is profoundly countercultural. But there is something powerful about staying, about not running away when things get tough, about working through conflicts instead of simply abandoning relationships, about persevering in a vocation or job even when it loses its novelty. I'm not talking about staying in abusive or harmful situations. There are times to leave, but we often leave too quickly, looking for the easy way out, and we miss the depth that only comes from staying. And finally, Benedict teaches us that holiness is not for spiritual superheroes. It is for ordinary people who are willing to show, day after day, to pray even when they feel nothing, to work even when they are tired, to love even when it is difficult. The rule of Benedict is attainable. It is demanding, yes, but not impossible. It is for all of us, not just for a few extraordinary individuals. An invitation to peace. And now, dear friends, as our story draws to a close and sleep begins to call us back, I want to invite you to something, to an experiment, if you will. Over the next few days or weeks, try incorporating a small part of the Benedictine spirit into your lives. Perhaps set aside a time for prayer each day. It doesn't have to be long. 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes at night. Simply being still before God. Perhaps reading a psalm or simply sitting in mindful silence. See what happens. See if you begin to notice a change within yourselves, a peace that gradually grows, an awareness of God that was there all along, but that you hadn't noticed. Or perhaps they'll experiment with the rhythm of work and rest. Instead of working to exhaustion, they'll set boundaries. Work intensely when it's time to work, but when it's time to rest, they'll truly rest. Turn off devices. Be present with family or friends. Take a walk in nature. Read a book. Pray. Really rest. Or practice hospitality this week. Invite someone over for a meal. Really listen when someone speaks to you, giving them your full attention instead of checking your phone. Smile at strangers. Be kind to the person serving you at a store or restaurant. Small acts of recognizing the humanity of others. Or when you feel tempted to self-promote or become proud, practice humility. Let others speak first. Admit when you don't know something. Give credit to others. See what it feels like to live without the constant burden of having to prove yourself. And above all, remember that God loves you. Not for what you do, not for how good you are, but simply because you are. That was the truth that sustained Benedict in his cave for 3 years. That was the truth that guided him as he wrote his rule. That was the truth that stayed with him until his last breath. And it is the truth that can sustain you too. As you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine for a moment that you are in a Benedictine monastery. It is late at night, after Compline, the last prayer of the day. The great silence has descended upon the monastery. You walk slowly through the cloister toward your cell. The full moon shines in the central courtyard, casting soft shadows. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hoots. The air is fresh and clean. They enter his cell. It is simple, austere. A narrow bed, a crucifix on the wall, a small window overlooking the dark valley below. But there is a profound peace in this simplicity. They need nothing more than this. Everything superfluous has been stripped away, and what remains is essential. They lie down in bed. The sheets are rough but clean. The pillow is thin but sufficient. And as they close their eyes, they hear in their minds the words of the final prayer of the day. Into your hands I commit my spirit. The same words Benedict prayed as he died. The same words millions of Benedictines have prayed for centuries. In your hands, not in ours. Not trying to control, to plan, to worry. Simply letting go, trusting, resting, like a child falling asleep in its parents' arms, completely safe, completely loved. May the example of Saint Benedict inspire you. May his rule guide you. May his peace fill you. May his love for God ignite love in your own hearts. Good night, dear friends. Sleep well. May your dreams be peaceful, and may you wake up tomorrow renewed, ready to seek God in the ordinary rhythm of your days, in the work of your hands, in the love you share with others. Saint Benedict of Nursia, Father of Western monasticism, pray for us. Amen. But before I let you drift off to sleep, let me tell you a little more about what happened after Benito, because his story didn't end with his death. In many ways, it was just beginning. The mountain that became the light of the world, Monte Cassino, the monastery Benedict built atop the mountain, outlived its founder by centuries. It became one of the great centers of Western Christianity. Its library became legendary, housing rare manuscripts found nowhere else. Its scriptorium produced beautiful books sought after by kings and bishops. But the history of Monte Cassino was not always peaceful. In 583, just 36 years after Benedict's death, the Lombards invaded Italy. They were one of the many barbarian tribes still roaming across Europe. They reached Monte Cassino and destroyed it. The buildings were burned, the walls torn down. The monks fled, taking with them their most precious possessions. The relics of Benedict and Scholastica, some manuscripts including the Rule, and their memory of how to live as Benedictines. They travelled north and found refuge in Rome, in a monastery near the Basilica of St. John Lateran. There they continued their life of prayer and work, keeping alive the flame that Benedict had kindled. And it was there, in Rome, that the young Gregory the Great found them. Gregory came from one of Rome's noblest families. He could have had a brilliant career in politics or administration, but after his father's death, he converted his family palace into a Benedictine monastery and became a monk. He lived as a Benedictine for several years, finding in the rule of Benedict exactly what his soul longed for: order, peace, a clear path to God. But then the Pope called him to service, first as papal legate in Constantinople. Then, upon his return, he was elected Pope himself, becoming Pope Gregory I, known as Gregory the Great. As Pope, Gregory never forgot his Benedictine life. He tried to maintain his rhythm of prayer as much as his position allowed. And it was he who wrote the Dialogues, the book in which he recounts the life of Benedict, based on the testimonies of 4 of the saint's disciples who were still alive when Gregory was young. These dialogues are our primary source for the life of Benedict. Without Gregory, we would know very little about the saint, and Gregory wrote them not as an academic exercise, but as an act of love and gratitude toward the man whose rule had transformed his life. It was also Gregory who sent Augustine and 40 Benedictine monks to England in 597. It was a risky mission. England was populated by pagan tribes, the Angles and Saxons, who had invaded after the Romans withdrew. The Christianity that had existed there in Roman times had been virtually eradicated. Augustine and his monks landed in Kent, in southern England. The King of Kent, Ethelbert, was married to a Christian princess from France, so there was already some familiarity with Christianity. Ethelbert allowed them to settle and preach, and slowly, patiently, using the Benedictine method of quiet example rather than aggressive confrontation, the monks began to convert England. They established monasteries. They taught the people. They celebrated Mass with such beauty that the pagans were captivated, and gradually England became a Christian nation. Benedictine monasteries multiplied throughout England. Each became a centre of learning and culture. And from England, Benedictine missionaries would later go on to evangelize other parts of Europe. Saint Boniface, whom we mentioned earlier, was one of them. Meanwhile, in Italy, after more than a century of abandonment, the Benedictine monks were finally able to return to Monte Cassino. The Lombards had settled and converted to Christianity. The region was more stable. So, around the year 720, the monks returned to the Holy Mountain and rebuilt the monastery. This second foundation of Monte Cassino was even more glorious than the first. The monastery grew in size and influence. Its library expanded to contain thousands of manuscripts. Its school attracted students from all over Europe. Popes visited Monte Cassino and sought the advice of the abbots. Emperors sent gifts and sought the monks' prayers. But once again, history intervened violently. In the year 883, the Saracens, Muslim pirates from North Africa, attacked Monte Cassino. They sacked the monastery and burned it. The monks fled again, this time to Capua, taking with them the relics of Benedict. Decades would pass before they could return and rebuild once more, but they did. And each time Monte Cassino was destroyed and rebuilt, it was like a parable of the spiritual life itself. We fall, but we rise. We are wounded, but we heal. Death does not have the final word. Resurrection does. The most famous reconstruction of Monte Cassino took place in the 11th century under Abbot Desiderius, who later became Pope Victor III. Desiderius rebuilt the monastery in a grand style, with a marble church, beautiful frescoes, and brilliant mosaics. He brought artists from Constantinople to decorate it. The result was a monastery of breathtaking beauty that became a model for other medieval churches. During the Middle Ages, Monte Cassino was at its zenith. Its scriptorium produced illuminated manuscripts of extraordinary quality. Its library was consulted by scholars from all over Europe. Its infirmary developed advanced medical knowledge for the time. Its music school contributed to the development of Gregorian chant, but perhaps the most important contribution of medieval Monte Cassino was the preservation of classical texts. Patient monks copied works by Cicero, Virgil, Ovid, and Tacitus, authors who would otherwise have been lost. They did not do so because they were pagans who loved classical literature more than scripture. They did so because, true to the spirit of Benedict, they believed that all truth comes from God, and that even pagan authors, when they wrote true and beautiful things, were participating in divine truth. Thus, Benedictine monasteries became the preservers of Western civilization. They safeguarded not only the Christian faith, but also classical knowledge. And when Europe began to emerge from the Dark Ages, when universities began to be founded in the 12th century, it was on the foundation of the knowledge preserved in Benedictine monasteries. The Reformation and the challenges remaining faithful. Like all human institutions, Benedictine monasteries were not immune to decline. There were periods when the rule was followed laxly, when monasteries became wealthy and comfortable, and the monks forgot the spirit of poverty and simplicity that Benedict had taught, and when politics and worldly power infiltrated the cloisters that should have been places of prayer. But the beautiful thing is that every time there was decline, reformers arose calling for a return to the original purity of the rule. In the 10th century, the monastery of Cluny in France initiated a reform that spread to hundreds of monasteries. The Cluniacs emphasized an elaborate and beautiful liturgy, transforming prayer into an art. In the 11th century, St. Robert of Molesme and his companions, feeling that even Cluny had become too rich and elaborate, founded a new monastery at Cîteaux, France. They wanted to return to the original simplicity of Benedict. These were the Cistercians, also called white monks because of the colour of their habits. The Cistercians emphasized hard manual labour, especially agriculture. They drained swamps, cultivated wastelands, and built model farms. They rejected elaborate decorations in their churches, preferring the beauty of simple lines and clear light. And they produced some of the greatest saints of the Middle Ages. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the most famous Cistercian, was one of the most influential men of the 12th century. He was an advisor to popes and kings, a preacher during the Second Crusade, a brilliant theologian, and above all, a profound mystic whose meditations on God's love still touch hearts today. And all this while living as a simple Cistercian monk, following the rule of Benedict. In the 17th century, there was another important reform. The Congregation of St. Maurice in France emphasized scholarly study alongside monastic life. The Maurists, as they were called, produced critical editions of the Church Fathers and other important works. They combined the highest scholarship with the deepest piety. But then came a challenge greater than any internal decline: the French Revolution and its aftermath. In 1790, the French Revolution suppressed all monasteries and convents in France. Monks were expelled, properties confiscated, and libraries dispersed. Many ancient monasteries were destroyed or converted into prisons or barracks. The suppression spread to other countries as revolutionary and later Napoleonic armies conquered Europe. In Germany, in Italy, in Spain, monasteries were closed. It seemed that Benedictine life, which had survived so many challenges for over 1,000 years, was finally going to disappear. Monte Cassino itself was suppressed in 1806 under Napoleon. The monks were expelled, and the monastery was used as a prison for a time. The great libraries were partly dispersed, with precious manuscripts ending up in national libraries throughout Europe. But again, like the phoenix, Benedictine life rose from the ashes. In the 19th century, there was a remarkable Benedictine revival. Ancient monasteries were refounded. New monasteries were established. The Benedictines flourished once more. One centre of this revival was the Abbey of Solesmes in France, founded in 1833. The monks of Solesmes dedicated themselves to reviving Gregorian chant, that ancient form of liturgical song that had been partially forgotten. They studied ancient manuscripts, restored the melodies to their original purity, and taught generations of monks and musicians to sing. Another centre was Büren Abbey in Germany, which developed a distinctive style of liturgical art that combined Byzantine influences with modern sensibilities. The Benedictines of Büren decorated churches throughout Europe with their distinctive murals and mosaics, and the Benedictines also expanded to the New World. Benedictine monasteries were established in the United States, Canada, and Latin America. They brought with them the rule of Benedict and found that it worked just as well on the plains of Minnesota or in the mountains of Brazil as it had worked in the hills of Italy 1400 years earlier. In the 20th century, Monte Cassino suffered its most terrible destruction. During World War II in 1944, the monastery found itself in the middle of fierce fighting between Allied and German forces. The Germans were using the mountain as an observation point. The Allies, believing, incorrectly as it turned out, that the Germans had fortified the monastery itself, bombarded it. The bombing was devastating. The 1,400-year-old monastery, with its treasures of art and precious manuscripts, was reduced to rubble. It was an immense cultural tragedy, but miraculously, the monks had evacuated beforehand, taking with them the relics of Benedict and the most important manuscripts. And after the war, once again, they rebuilt. The Monte Cassino that exists today, rebuilt in the 1950s and 60s, is a faithful replica of the monastery that stood before the war. And once again, the monks chant the hours, cultivate the land, welcome pilgrims, and keep alive the flame that Benedict lit so many centuries ago. The gift of Benito. Peace in a broken world. What ultimately did Benito give us? Why does his legacy endure when so many other figures of his time have been forgotten? I believe Benedict gave us something every generation needs, but that each generation must rediscover for itself: a path to peace. Not peace as the absence of conflict. That would be impossible in this broken world. But peace as the presence of God. Peace in the midst of the storm. Peace that surpasses all understanding. Benito found that peace in his cave in Subiaco during those 3 years of solitude with God. And then he spent the rest of his life teaching others how to find it too. Not by telling them they had to go live in a cave, not everyone is called to that, but by showing them how to create spaces of peace in the midst of ordinary life. The Rule of Benedict is essentially a manual for creating peace. Peace within oneself through humility and acceptance of who we are. Peace with others through community life lived with charity and patience. Peace with God through constant prayer. And peace with creation through work that honors what God has made. In a world that seems increasingly chaotic, divided, noisy, and anxious, we need Benedictine peace more than ever. We need its spaces of silence where we can hear beyond the noise. We need its balanced rhythm where work and rest healthily intertwine. We need its radical hospitality that sees Christ in every person. We need its humility that frees us from the tyranny of the ego. We need its stability that teaches us to remain and grow deeply instead of fleeing superficially. And the beautiful thing is that we don't need to become monks to receive these gifts. Benedict wrote for monks, yes, but the principles he articulated transcend the cloister. They are for everyone. We can practice Benedictine silence by turning off our devices and simply being still for a few moments each day. We can practice Benedictine rhythm by setting regular times for prayer, work, meals, and rest, instead of letting our days become chaotic. We can practice Benedictine hospitality by opening our homes and hearts to others. We can practice Benedictine humility by letting go of the constant need to promote and justify ourselves. And as we do, something wonderful happens. We begin to experience the peace that Benito knew. Not immediately, not perfectly, but gradually, truly. The inner turmoil begins to subside. Relationships begin to heal. Life begins to make sense again. This isn't magic. It's simply living in accordance with how we were made. God created us for rhythm, not chaos. He created us for community, not isolation. He created us for prayer, not constant distraction. He created us for meaningful work, not frantic, purposeless activity. Benito simply rediscovered these ancient principles and articulated them in a way that people of his time and of all times after could follow them. And that is why his legacy endures. A final prayer. May they find what Benito found. Dear friends, as we approach the true end of this evening together, I want to offer a prayer. A prayer for you, for me, for all of us who seek God in the midst of complicated lives. May they find the silence that Benedict found in his cave. Not an empty silence, but a silence filled with the presence of God. A silence where the soul can finally rest. May they find the rhythm that Benedict taught. Not the frenzy of modern life, but the gentle flow between work and prayer, activity and rest, being with others and being alone. May they find the community that Benito built. Not the superficiality of 1,000 social media contacts, but the depth of a few genuine relationships where they are truly known and completely loved. May they find the humility that Benedict lived. Not the false humility that is really pride in disguise, but the true humility that recognizes both our gifts and our limitations and rests in the love of God. May they find the work that Benito valued, not the work that exhausts and dehumanizes, but the work that gives purpose and allows collaboration with God in caring for creation. May they find the hospitality that Benedict practiced, not selective hospitality only for those like us, but radical hospitality that sees Christ in every person, especially in the stranger and the needy. May they find the peace that Benedict knew, not the peace of the world that depends on external circumstances, but the peace of Christ that remains even in the midst of storm, and that when their days on this earth come to an end, as they came to an end for Benito on that 21st of March, so many centuries ago, they may die as he died, supported by brothers and sisters who love them, with a prayer on their lips, with their eyes fixed on heaven, with hearts full of hope. Because death is not the end. Benedict knew this. His monks saw him ascend to heaven in a vision, and that same hope is ours as well. The tomb where Benedict and Scholastica rest at Monte Cassino is not the end of their story. It is only a pause, a sleep, awaiting the resurrection when all who have loved God will rise to new life. Saint Benedict of Nursia, father of so many monks and nuns, teacher of countless souls, pray for us. Help us to find the path you found. Help us to live the balance you taught. Help us to love God as you loved him. And now, my friends, it is truly time to rest. You have heard the story of a man who sought God with all his heart and found him. A man who lived 1500 years ago, but whose life still speaks to us today. Close your eyes. Breathe deeply. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the mattress, completely supported, completely safe. There is nothing to do now except rest. Imagine you are back in that monastery after Compline. The great silence has fallen. You are in your simple cell. The moon shines softly through the window. You can hear, very faintly, the chanting of the monks who continue the vigil in the chapel, praying for the world while the world sleeps. But you don't need to keep vigil tonight. You can sleep. And while you sleep, those prayers cover you like a cloak. The prayers of Benedict from so many centuries ago. The prayers of all the Benedictines who have lived since then. The prayers of all the saints in heaven. All those prayers surround you, protect you, and sustain you. Sleep well, dear friends. Sleep in the peace of God that surpasses all understanding. Sleep knowing that you are infinitely loved. Sleep knowing that no matter what challenges tomorrow brings, God will be there with you. And when you awaken, when the light of a new day filters through your windows, awaken with a grateful heart, grateful for the gift of another day, grateful for the life you have with all its challenges and joys, grateful for the example of Saint Benedict, who shows us that it is possible to live differently, that it is possible to find peace in the midst of chaos, that it is possible to make our entire life a prayer. Ora et labora, pray and work. Let that be your motto tomorrow and every day. Pray with your words and with your actions. Work with your hands and with your hearts. And in that flow between prayer and work, find the fulfillment that God desires for you. Good evening. May God bless you. May God keep you. May God fill you with his peace. Saint Benedict, pray for us. Good night. Now, if you'll allow me one last thought before sleep finally claims you completely. A thought about bells. The bells of the Benedictine monastery have rung for centuries, ringing to call the monks to prayer 7 times a day, ringing to mark the beginning and end of work, ringing to call the monks to meals, ringing to announce the death of a brother, ringing to celebrate great feasts. Those bells are like the heartbeat of the monastery, regular, constant, reliable. No matter what is happening in the outside world, the bells continue to ring. Wars may ravage countries, kings may rise and fall, the world's climate may change, but the bells still call to prayer. There is something deeply comforting about that. In a world of constant change, where nothing seems permanent, the bells remind us that some things do endure. Prayer endures. Community endures. The search for God endures. And tonight, as you sleep, imagine that you can hear those bells. Not literally, of course, but in your imagination, in your heart. Hear the Compline bells ringing, marking the end of the day, inviting you to rest. And tomorrow, when you wake up, imagine that you hear the bells of Lauds, the dawn prayer, calling you to a new day. Every day is a new beginning. Every day is another opportunity to seek God, to live in peace, to love others. The bells are ringing. Do you hear them? They are calling your name. They are inviting you to join that great procession of souls who have sought God throughout the ages. to join Benedict and Scholastica, Maurus and Placidus, all the Benedictine saints, known and unknown, in the eternal quest for the one thing that truly matters, to know and love God. The bells are ringing, and in their sound is all the wisdom you need. Come, pray, work, love, rest, and above all, trust. God is with you. God loves you. God guides you. The bells are ringing, and now, finally, truly, it's time to sleep. Good night, dear friends, until we meet again. And if you enjoyed this journey into the life of Saint Benedict, if this story brought you peace and helped you sleep better, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Saints for Sleep. There are so many more saints whose stories I want to share with you. So many more lives that inspire us, comfort us, and show us the way to God. Subscribe so you don't miss any of these stories. And if you know someone who might benefit from these calming audio recordings, please share this channel with them. We all need peace. We all need good examples. We all need to be reminded that we are loved by God. Until next time, may you sleep in peace. May your dreams be serene. And may Saint Benedict, that great master of peace, always guide you to the heart of God. Good night, blessings, and sweet dream. Saint Benedict of Nursia, the father of sacred silence. Welcome, dear friends, to Saints for Sleeping. Tonight, as darkness envelops the world and the stars twinkle overhead, I invite you on an extraordinary journey. A journey not only through time, but into the depths of silence, to those sacred places where the soul finds its true rest. Imagine for a moment the hills of Italy at sunset. The sun dips behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. In the distance, the soft tolling of a bell can be heard. It is Vespers, the evening prayer. The monks walk in single file, their black habits gently brushing against the ancient stones of the cloister. Their steps are measured, serene, as if each movement were a prayer in itself. This is the world we will explore together tonight. The world of Saint Benedict of Nursia, the father of Western monasticism, the man who taught us that God is found in silence and peace. Breathe deeply. Let your bodies sink into the comfort of where you are resting. Allow the worries of the day to dissolve like mist in the morning sun. The story I'm about to tell you happened more than 1400 years ago, but its echoes resonate to this day. It's a story of searching, of chosen solitude, of found community. It's the story of a man who fled the noise of the world to find God's voice in silence. And in doing so, he changed the course of Western history, preserved civilization, and left us a path to inner peace that remains relevant in our busy times. Conflict and opposition, the price of holiness. Not far from Benedict's monasteries lived a priest named Florentius. He was the parish priest of a local church, and at first he had welcomed the monk's presence. But gradually, as Benedict's reputation grew, Florentius began to feel envious. People went to see Benedict instead of going to him. The wealthy gave their donations to monasteries instead of to his church. Young people sought to become Benedict's monks instead of seeking his spiritual guidance. Florentius, instead of rejoicing that souls were finding God, was filled with bitterness and jealousy. At first, he only murmured against Benito, spreading rumors, trying to discredit his reputation. But when this didn't work, when people continued to venerate Benito, Florencio resorted to darker means. One day, he sent a servant to Benito with a gift, a loaf of bread. It seemed like a gesture of reconciliation, of friendship, but the bread was poisoned. Florencio, in his wickedness, hoped that Benito would eat the bread and die. Benito gratefully accepted the bread, but before he could even think about eating it, something extraordinary happened. A crow, one of those that frequented the area in search of food, flew up to Benito. It was a crow that Benito had fed before, one that had come to trust the saint. Benedict, by divine inspiration, or perhaps simply sensing that something was wrong with the bread, offered it to the raven, saying, "In the name of Jesus Christ, take this bread and carry it to a place where no man can find it. The crow took the bread in its beak, but it didn't fly away immediately. It cawed and circled around Benito, as if protesting, as if it didn't want to leave without its usual reward of crumbs. Benito insisted, "Take it far away, and God will reward you." Finally, the crow obeyed. It took the poisoned bread and flew away, and didn't return until 3 hours later, when it had finally found a place remote enough to leave the bread. Benito did not publicly denounce Florencio. He neither accused him nor sought revenge, but the priest's continued hostility made the situation increasingly difficult. Florencio did not stop with the poisoning attempt. He began sending women of ill repute to the monastery, trying to tempt the young monks. In the monastery courtyard, where the monks could see them, these women danced and behaved provocatively. For Benedict, this was the final straw. Not so much for himself, who had overcome such temptations long ago, but for his young monks. Some of them were just beginning their spiritual journey. Exposing them to such deliberate temptations was endangering their souls. Furthermore, Benito recognized something in all of this. He recognized that Florencio's hatred wasn't really directed at him personally, but rather at the work of God being accomplished through him. And if his presence in Subiaco was causing such a scandal, such conflict, then perhaps it was time to leave, not out of defeat, but out of wisdom. There was another reason to consider moving too. The 12 monasteries of Subiaco were functioning well. There were competent abbots at the head of each, men whom Benedict himself had trained. Perhaps it was time to start something new, something bigger. A vision had been growing in Benedict's heart, the vision of a single, large monastery, where he could fully implement his ideas about monastic life, where he could write a complete rule that could guide future generations. And so, with a group of his closest monks, Benedict left Subiaco. It was a bittersweet farewell. He had spent decades there, from his solitary days in the cave to the establishment of the 12 monasteries. But he was ready for the next chapter. He headed south toward a place called Monte Cassino. The story goes that shortly after Benedict left, Florentius, the priest who had so relentlessly persecuted him, was standing on his balcony when it collapsed beneath him. He fell to his death. One of Benedict's monks, named Mauro, rushed to tell him the news, thinking he would rejoice at his enemy's death. But Benedict wept. He wept for Florentius's downfall, for a life wasted on envy and hatred, and he ordered Mauro to do penance for rejoicing in the misfortune of another, even an enemy. This incident reveals much about Benito's character. There was no malice in him, nor any desire for revenge. Even toward those who had wronged him, he felt only compassion and sorrow for their lost souls. Monte Cassino. The vision reaches its fulfillment. Monte Cassino rises above the road connecting Rome and Naples, a 500-meter-high mountain overlooking the Liri River Valley. From its summit, one can see for miles in every direction. It is a place of austere beauty and ancient power. When Benedict arrived there around the year 529, the mountaintop was crowned by an ancient temple dedicated to Apollo. Paganism had not yet completely died out in Italy. In rural areas especially, people still made offerings to the old gods and still practiced rites that came from time immemorial. The temple at Monte Cassino, although partially ruined, was still a site of pagan worship. Benedict immediately saw the potential of the place. The location was perfect, remote enough for contemplation, but not so inaccessible as to be completely isolated. There was fertile land all around where the monks could grow food. There was abundant water from natural springs. And there was something else, something that Benedict perceived with his spiritual sensitivity. This was a place where God wanted to establish a stronghold of prayer. But first, the pagan temple had to be consecrated. It wasn't enough to simply occupy the space. Places have memory. They have a spiritual atmosphere. This place had been dedicated to a false god for centuries. It needed to be cleansed, purified, reclaimed for the true God. Benedict, with his monks, began the work. They destroyed the pagan altar. They tore down the idol of Apollo. They cut down the sacred grove that surrounded the temple, those trees that the pagans considered inhabited by spirits. And while they worked, Benedict never ceased to pray, asking God to expel all power of darkness from the place. Tradition tells that the demons did not leave without a fight. The monks working to destroy the pagan temple reported seeing dark figures, hearing threatening voices, and experiencing inexplicable bouts of terror. But Benedict, with his unwavering faith and spiritual authority, confronted them. He prayed, made the sign of the cross, and invoked the name of Christ. And gradually, the place was cleansed. Where the temple of Apollo had stood, Benedict built a chapel dedicated to Saint Martin of Tours, that great saint who had been a soldier before becoming a monk and bishop, symbolizing the spiritual struggle. And near where the pagan altar had been, he built another chapel dedicated to Saint John the Baptist, the prophet who prepared the way for Christ. Then the construction of the monastery itself began. It was neither quick nor easy. Materials had to be brought up the mountain, the rocky terrain had to be leveled, and buildings had to be designed and constructed that would serve not only as living quarters, but as the foundation for an entire way of life. Benedict designed the monastery with great care. At its heart was the church, for the worship of God was paramount. Surrounding the church was the cloister, a square courtyard enclosed by columns where the monks could walk and meditate, sheltered from the sun and rain. Connected to the cloister were the cells where the monks slept, the library where precious books were kept and copied, the refectory where they ate, the kitchen, the storerooms, the scriptorium where the monks copied manuscripts, and the hospice for pilgrims and travellers. Everything was designed with a purpose. The architecture itself taught spiritual lessons. The spaces flowed naturally from one to another, facilitating the rhythm of prayer and work. There were places for community and places for solitude. There was beauty without ostentation, simplicity without poverty. It was both functional and beautiful, reflecting Benedict's belief that God is glorified in both ordered beauty and holiness. And as the monastery grew physically, Benedict began to write his entire life, all his experience, from his solitary days in the cave to his time with the troubled monks of Vicovaro, to the founding of the 12 monasteries of Subiaco, had taught him profound lessons about how the monastic life should be lived. Now, at Monte Cassino, he began to put these lessons into writing. He was writing what would become one of the most influential documents in Western history, the Rule of Saint Benedict. The Rule, wisdom for all generations. The Rule of Saint Benedict was not the first monastic document. Other rules already existed, written by figures such as Saint Basil in the East and Saint Augustine in the West. But the Rule of Benedict was different. It was practical without being legalistic. It was demanding without being impossible. It was spiritual without being abstract. It was, in a word, balanced, and that balance is what made it endure when other rules were forgotten. Benedict begins his rule with a prologue that is itself a spiritual gem. "Listen, my son," he says, using the language of a father speaking lovingly to his child. It is not the tone of a lawgiver imposing laws, but of a guide showing a path. Listen with the ear of your heart to the instructions of the Master. Receive them willingly and put them into practice effectively. There is a tenderness in those words that disarms any resistance. Benito isn't imposing a heavy burden. He's inviting us on an adventure, on a path of life that may be demanding but leads to true joy. The rule is organized into 73 chapters, some long, others just a few sentences. It covers everything you need to know to live in a monastic community, and it does so with refreshing realism. Benedict understood human nature. He knew that monks are not angels but men with all human weaknesses, so he writes for real people, not for idealized saints. The heart of the rule is what is called the divine office, those regular prayers that mark the hours of the day and night. Benedict established 7 times of prayer during the day, plus 1 in the middle of the night, based on the psalm that says, "7 times a day I praise you." These prayers, primarily chanting the psalms, ensure that the monk's entire life is permeated with prayer, that he is never far from the presence of God. But Benedict is well aware that not everyone can pray with the same intensity. So he gives instructions on how to adapt the prayers according to the seasons, the monk's age, and their abilities. In summer, when the days are long and the work is heavy, the evening prayers are shorter. In winter, when the nights are long, there is more time for extended prayer. Regarding manual labor, Benedict is clear and firm. Idleness is the enemy of the soul. Therefore, the brothers should occupy themselves at certain times with manual labor and at other designated times with spiritual reading. Ora et labora. Not one at the expense of the other, but both in harmony. And the work isn't just to keep busy, it's genuinely productive. The monks cultivate fields, raise animals, bake bread, make tools, and copy books. The monastery is expected to be as self-sufficient as possible, not relying on the charity of others, but working honestly for its sustenance. And if they produce more than they need, they must share it with the poor. Regarding food, Benedict is moderate, neither too strict nor too indulgent. 2 meals a day, each with 2 cooked courses, so that if someone cannot eat one, they can eat the other. Enough bread, seasonal fruit and vegetable, a modest amount of wine. Although we read that wine is not appropriate for monks, Benedict adds with a touch of humour. But since in our times monks cannot be convinced of this, let us at least agree not to drink to excess. It is this flexibility, this recognition of human weaknesses without condescending to them, that makes the rule so beautiful. Benedict asks for much, but not the impossible. He calls us to perfection, but he doesn't forget that we are on the path toward it, not already at the goal. An entire chapter of the rule is dedicated to hospitality. All guests who come to the monastery are to be received as Christ, Benedict writes. No matter who the visitor is, rich or poor, noble or commoner, Christian or pagan, all must be received with honor and love, because in each one we may be unknowingly receiving Christ himself. The monks must wash the feet of visitors, just as Christ washed the feet of his disciples. They must give them the best they have. The abbot himself must break his fast, if necessary, to eat with the guests, showing them honor. In a world where hospitality was often only for those from whom something was expected in return, this unconditional hospitality was revolutionary. There are chapters on how to care for sick brothers and sisters, with instructions to treat them as if they were Christ himself. There are chapters on how to treat children and the elderly, with special tenderness because of their vulnerability. There are chapters on how to correct those who err, with a beautiful balance between firmness and mercy. And there is one chapter, chapter 7, which many consider the spiritual heart of the entire rule, the chapter on humility. Benedict describes 12 degrees or steps of humility, like a ladder that ascends to heaven. The first step is the fear of God, not in the sense of terror, but of profound reverence. The last step is perfect love, which casts out all fear. But it is in the intermediate steps that we see Benedict's profound spiritual psychology. He speaks of submitting your will to the will of God. He speaks of confessing your sins and temptations to your spiritual superior, hiding nothing out of shame. He speaks of being content with the lowest and most ordinary things, of considering yourself the least and most worthless of men, not in false modesty, but in genuine recognition of your complete dependence on God's grace. And what's remarkable is that Benedict doesn't present these as punishments or burdens, but as steps toward freedom. Humility, in his understanding, is not self-destruction, but self-discovery. It's finding your true place in the universe, not as the center of everything, not as nothing, but as a beloved creature of God, with infinite dignity precisely because you are loved, not because of your achievements. The rule also establishes the figure of the abbot as central to the life of the monastery. The abbot, says Benedict, acts in the place of Christ in the monastery. It is a tremendous responsibility. Benedict dedicates several chapters to describing what an abbot should be: wise but not harsh, demanding but not impossible, loving everyone but adapting his treatment to each according to their needs. The abbot must always remember who he is and what his name is, Benedict writes. He must know that the more entrusted to him, the more is required of him. The abbot must teach more by example than by words. He must be equally serious with the rich as with the poor. He must have no favorites, and above all, he must remember that on the day of judgment, he will have to give an account to God for every soul entrusted to him. It is a vision of leadership as service, as spiritual fatherhood, radically different from the model of power and domination that prevailed in the world. And it worked. Benedictine monasteries, guided by abbots trained in this vision, became places of peace, order, and holiness in the midst of a chaotic world. But the rule is not only about the abbot's authority, it also emphasizes consultation and community participation. When important decisions need to be made, Benedict says, the abbot should gather the entire community and listen to their advice. Often God reveals what is best to the youngest, he observes. He should listen especially to the older, more experienced brothers. And only after listening to everyone should the abbot decide. It is a beautiful blend of clear authority and respect for every member of the community. It is not democracy in the modern sense. The abbot is not obligated to do what the majority wants, but neither is it tyranny. It is a model of consultative and paternal leadership that recognizes both the need for clear authority and the value of each individual. And throughout the rule there is an emphasis on moderation, on the middle way. Benedict rejects both laxity and excessive rigor. He wants to form holy monks, yes, but also healthy ones, capable of persevering in the monastic life for decades, not heroes who burn out in a few years of extreme penance. We hope that this rule contains nothing harsh or burdensome, he writes near the end. But if there is anything a little strict, dictated by reasons of justice to correct vices or preserve charity, do not be overcome by fear and flee from the path of salvation, which is always narrow at the beginning. But as you advance in the monastic life and in faith, you will run with an expansive heart and unspeakable sweetness of love along the path of God's commandments. It is a beautiful promise that what at first seems difficult will, with grace and time, become sweet. That discipline is not a prison, but the path to a deeper freedom. That obedience to God is not slavery, but the discovery of who we were always meant to be. The rule ends on a note of humility. Benedict calls it this little rule for beginners. He acknowledges that it is not perfect, that there are greater heights of spiritual life described in Scripture and in the writings of the Desert Fathers. But he says, with God's help, you can get there, to those higher peaks, but start here. This rule, written at Monte Cassino in the last years of Benedict's life, would become the foundational document of Western monastic life. It would be adopted by thousands of monasteries throughout Europe. It would be the foundation upon which medieval civilization would be built. Benedictine monks, living according to this rule, would preserve classical knowledge through the Dark Ages, copy scripture and ancient texts, teach agriculture and crafts, and establish schools and hospitals. But all that was in the future. While Benedict was writing at Monte Cassino, he was simply trying to provide practical guidance for his own monks. He didn't know, he couldn't have known, that he was writing for the ages. The miracles of Monte Cassino, signs of God's power. As the monastery of Monte Cassino grew, both physically and spiritually, miracles continued to occur around Benedict. He did not seek them out, nor did he make a spectacle of them. They simply flowed naturally from his profound union with God, like perfume flowing naturally from a rose. There was a young monk in the monastery named Placid. One day he was drawing water from the lake near the monastery. He leaned too far over the water, lost his balance, and fell in. The lake was deep at that point, and Placid wasn't a very good swimmer. He began to sink, pulled down by the current. Benedict, who was in his cell at the time, had a vision of the danger. He immediately called another monk, Maurus, and said to him, "Brother Maurus, run. The boy Placidus has fallen into the lake, and the current is carrying him away." Mauro ran, asking the abbot for his blessing as he left. He ran as fast as he could toward the lake. And then, in his haste to save his brother, he did something extraordinary, without even realizing what he was doing. He ran on water. Yes, Like Peter in the Gospel, Mauro walked on water. He ran about 100 paces across the surface of the lake, grabbed Placido by the hair, and dragged him back to shore. Only when he was back on dry land, only when he looked back and saw the water behind him, did Mauro realize what had happened. He was filled with amazement and fear. When he returned to Benedict, Mauro attributed the miracle to the abbot's blessing and prayers. But Benedict, ever humble, said it was Mauro's obedience that had made the miracle possible. Placidus, who had been rescued, would later say that as he sank, he had seen the abbot's mantle above his head, as if Benedict himself were pulling him from the water. This miracle reveals something beautiful about the spiritual life. God's power works through our obedience and our faith. Mauro didn't know he was walking on water. He was simply obeying his abbot's command and trusting in the blessing he had received. And in that unquestioning obedience, in that simple faith, God worked. Another day, the monks were working on building a wall. They had erected a high wall and were placing a large, heavy stone on top. But the stone, poorly balanced or perhaps pushed by the wind, fell. It didn't simply fall to the ground, but fell on a young monk who was working below. The boy was completely crushed. His brothers ran to him, but there seemed to be no hope. His body was mangled, his bones clearly broken in multiple places. They wrapped him in a sheet and ran to Benito. Benedict sent everyone else out of the room. He knelt beside the young monk's mangled body and began to pray. He prayed with an intensity that the monks waiting outside could feel, even though they couldn't hear the words. He prayed for a long time, and then, miraculously, the young man opened his eyes. He sat up. He stood up. He moved his arms and legs. There was no pain, no fracture. It was as if the stone had never touched him. Benedict told him to return to his work, and the young monk, amazed but obedient, did so. The other monks saw him return, completely healed, and they glorified God. There were also miracles of a more domestic, more intimate nature, which show God's providential care for everyday needs. One year, there was a great famine in the region. The crops had failed. People were dying of hunger. And the monastery, which normally had enough, also began to run out of food. The monks were worried. They looked at the nearly empty storehouses and wondered what they would do. But Benedict told them, "Why do you let your hearts be discouraged because of the lack of bread? It is true that today there is little, but tomorrow you will have plenty." And so it was. The next day, a wealthy man from the region, inspired by God, sent 200 bushels of flour to the monastery. It was more than enough to feed the monks for months. No one knew where this benefactor came from. They had never seen him before, but everyone recognized the hand of God providing for his faithful servants. These stories of miracles, recounted and retold by Saint Gregory the Great in his biography of Benedict, are not mere entertainment. They are testimonies to the power of God at work in this world. They are reminders that God is not a distant abstraction, but a living and active presence who cares for us, who responds to faith and prayer. But perhaps more important than the physical miracles were the spiritual miracles that happened every day at Monte Cassino. Men arrived there broken by sin and found healing. They arrived troubled and found peace. They arrived empty and were filled with the Spirit. They arrived as selfish individuals and learned to live in community, in genuine love for their brothers and sisters. These were the true miracles, the ones that made no noise, the ones that happened silently in hearts, but which were as real and as powerful as any physical healing or multiplication of loaves. And Benedict knew it. He valued a monk who grew in humility more than one who performed miracles. He valued quiet faithfulness in daily duties more than spectacular mystical experiences. Scholasticism, fraternal love in its purest form. We have talked a lot about Benedict and his monks, about Monte Cassino and the Rule. But there is another figure in Benedict's life that we cannot forget. His twin sister, Scholastica. Scholastica had followed her brother into the religious life. While Benedict founded monasteries for men, she had established a convent for women not far from Monte Cassino. We don't know much about her life, but we can imagine that it was similar to that of her brother's monks, a life of prayer, work, silence, and community. Benedict and Scholastica, though separated by the demands of their respective vocations and by the strict customs of separation between communities of men and women, maintained contact. Once a year, they met in a house roughly halfway between Monte Cassino and Scholastica's convent. There they spent the day together, speaking of God, sharing their spiritual experiences, and encouraging one another on their journey. One year, when they were both elderly, the time came for their annual meeting. It was winter, and Benedict came down from the mountain with some of his monks. Scholastica arrived with some of her nuns. They met at their usual house and spent the day, as always, in holy conversation. They talked about the scriptures, about the challenges of leading their respective communities, about the joy of serving God. They ate a simple meal together. Time passed sweetly, as it only can when two souls who deeply love each other meet in the presence of God. But as the sun began to set and the shadows lengthened, Benedict rose to leave. He had to return to Monte Cassino before it became completely dark. He had responsibilities, evening prayers to lead. Scholastica, looking at her brother, felt something in her heart. A certainty, perhaps, that this would be their last meeting in this life, and she didn't want it to end so soon. Please, she begged Benedict, stay tonight. Let's continue talking about the joys of heaven until morning. Benedict refused, not harshly, but firmly. What are you saying, sister? There's no way I can spend the night away from my monastery. I have the rule. I have my obligations. Scholastica lowered her head, and then she did something extraordinary. She placed her hands together on the table, bowed her head over them, and began to pray. She prayed silently, but with fierce intensity, pouring out her heart before God. And God heard his prayer. When Scholastica lifted her head from her hands, the sky, which moments before had been clear and starry, suddenly filled with dark clouds. Thunder rumbled, and then it began to rain. Not an ordinary rain, but a torrential downpour. Lightning lit up the sky. The wind howled. It was impossible, absolutely impossible, to think of traveling in such conditions. Benito looked at his sister with a mixture of astonishment and exasperation. "What have you done, sister?" he asked. Scholastica, with a gentle smile on her elderly face, replied, "Look, I asked you for a favor, and you didn't listen to me. So I asked my Lord, and he listened. Now go if you can. Leave me and go back to your monastery." Benito could only laugh, overcome by his sister's love and faith, and by God's evident approval of his request. So he stayed. They spent the whole night awake, talking about heavenly things, sharing the joys and mysteries of the spiritual life. It was a beautiful night, one of those nights that shine in memory like jewels. The storm raged outside, but inside there was peace, warmth, and brotherly love in its purest form. They talked until the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world cleansed and refreshed. The air smelled of damp earth and promise. Then, and only then, did the storm begin to gradually subside. The clouds parted, allowing the first rays of sunlight to touch the drenched hills. Everything glowed with that special radiance that only comes after a night's storm. Benito and Scholastica said goodbye on the threshold of that house. They embraced these two twin siblings, now elderly, marked by decades of life dedicated to God. Did Scholastica know this was their last embrace? Did Benito feel it too? Perhaps. There are things the heart knows before the mind understands them. "Go in peace, brother," Scholastica said gently, "and pray for me, as I always pray for you." "Always, my sister," Benito replied, "until we meet again." "Yes," she said with a mysterious smile, "until we meet again, and it won't be long." Benito returned to Monte Cassino, his heart strangely full. There was something about that night's encounter that had been different, deeper, more definitive. But he was at peace. He had spent those precious hours with his twin sister, They had spoken of eternal things. And now he could return to his duties with a renewed heart. 3 days later, Benedict was in his cell, perhaps reading the scriptures, perhaps praying, perhaps simply resting in that contemplative stillness he had learned to value so much. Suddenly, he felt the urge to go to the window and look outside. It was a beautiful winter afternoon. The sky was clear, that deep, intense blue you only see on cold, crystal-clear days. The sun was beginning to descend toward the horizon, painting the distant clouds gold and pink. And then Benito saw something extraordinary. He saw the sky open, as if a gigantic door had opened in the heavens. And from that opening descended a light brighter than the sun, purer than anything earthly. And in the midst of that light, ascending toward the celestial heights, he saw a shape that he immediately recognized. It was Scholastica. Or more precisely, it was Scholastica's soul, freed from her earthly body, flying toward her true home, and the form it took was that of a white dove, an ancient symbol of the Holy Spirit, a symbol of purity and peace. The dove ascended effortlessly, with evident joy, toward the open arms of God. Benito watched with tears streaming down his face. They were tears of sorrow for earthly loss, yes. He would never see his sister again in this life. They would never have their annual reunions again. But they were also tears of profound joy. Scholastica had completed her race. She had fought the good fight. She had kept the faith. And now she was receiving the crown of righteousness that the Lord, the righteous judge, gives to all who love him. "Go, my sister," whispered Benedict, raising his hand in blessing toward heaven. "Go to your reward. You have loved much, and now you enter into perfect love. Pray for us from heaven, as you prayed for us on earth." Immediately, Benedict sent friars to Scholastica's convent to confirm what he already knew, and they found exactly what they expected. Scholastica had died peacefully that afternoon, at the precise moment Benedict had had his vision. She had been surrounded by her sisters, had received the last rites, had murmured a final prayer, and then, with a serene smile on her face, had simply closed her eyes and departed. The nuns said her death was so peaceful that at first they weren't sure it had happened. There was no struggle, no agony. It was as if she had simply fallen asleep and her soul had slipped out of her body, like someone leaving one room and entering another. Benedict had Scholastica's body brought to Monte Cassino. She was buried in the tomb he had prepared for himself in the monastery chapel. "Those who were so united in life by their service to God," Benedict said, "should not be separated in death." It was a beautiful gesture, full of meaning. In a time when brothers and sisters, even twins, were often separated by life's circumstances, in death, at least they would be together. They would await together the resurrection of the last day, when all who have fallen asleep in Christ will rise to new life. The days after Scholastica's death were filled with quiet mourning at Monte Cassino. The monks loved their abbot and shared their grief, but there was something else as well, a growing sense that Benedict's own time on earth was drawing to a close. If Scholastica, his twin sister, had departed, how much longer could he remain? The saint's last days, preparing for departure. After Scholastica's death, Benedict seemed to change subtly. Outwardly, he remained the same, leading prayers, teaching the monks, overseeing the work of the monastery, receiving visitors. But those who knew him well noticed a difference. There was a more ethereal quality to him, as if part of him were already elsewhere. His eyes, always shining with an inner light, now seemed to see beyond the visible. He was an old man now, probably nearing 70, which was a very advanced age in those times when life expectancy was much lower than it is today. His body, weakened by decades of fasting and hard work in austere conditions, was beginning to fail more noticeably. Climbing the monastery steps left him breathless. His hands, which had done so much work, trembled slightly. His step, once firm and quick, was now slow and careful. But his spirit remained strong, shining even brighter as his body weakened. It was as if, as the end of his earthly life drew near, the veil between this world and the next grew ever thinner for him. In the last months of his life, Benedict worked with renewed urgency to ensure that everything would be in order for when he was gone. He wanted his monks to be fully prepared to carry on without him. God's work could not stop simply because one man, even the founder, had departed. He reviewed the rule one last time, making sure everything was clear, that there were no ambiguities that could cause disputes later. He added some final clarifications, polished a few phrases. It wasn't that he doubted what he had written, but that he wanted it to be as perfect as possible, knowing that it would guide generations of monks long after his death. He appointed capable leaders for the various aspects of monastery life. He identified brothers with leadership gifts, spiritual wisdom, and practical skills. He prepared them carefully, teaching them not only what to do, but why to do it, imparting to them not only techniques, but also spirit. He spoke with each monk individually, setting aside time for final personal meetings. To each he gave specific words of encouragement and advice, tailored to their particular needs. To one struggling with doubts, he reassured him of God's faithfulness. To another, impatient with slow spiritual progress, he reminded him that holiness is a lifelong endeavor. To a third, feeling useless, he pointed out the gifts that others failed to see in him, but that Benedict had discerned. These encounters were precious to the monks. Years later, decades later, they would recall those last conversations with their father, Benedict. They would remember every word, every gesture, every glance, and in moments of difficulty in their own lives, they would return to those words in their memory and find in them guidance and comfort. And Benedict prayed. He prayed more than ever, if that was possible for a man whose entire life had been prayer. He spent long hours in the chapel, often alone, especially in the dead of night when the monastery slept. The monks who kept the night watch would see him there, kneeling before the altar or standing with his arms outstretched in the form of a cross, motionless for so long that he seemed like a statue. His face, in those moments of deep prayer, literally shone, emitting a soft light that came not from candles or lamps, but from within, as if the fire of the Holy Spirit burned so intensely inside him that it became visible outwardly. The monks who saw him were overcome with reverent awe. They felt they were witnessing something sacred, something normally hidden from mortal eyes. There was a memorable occasion, shortly before his death, when some of his monks found him levitating during prayer. He was not standing on his feet. He was suspended in the air, perhaps half a meter above the chapel floor, his body rigid in mystical ecstasy, his face radiant with celestial light. The monks who entered and witnessed this stood frozen in the doorway. They dared not move, barely dared to breathe. It was too sacred a moment to interrupt. One of them would later describe the scene. It was as if he were no longer entirely of this world. It was as if God were lifting him up, preparing him for the final ascent. We don't know how long this ecstasy lasted. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Time loses its meaning in the direct presence of God. But eventually, gradually, Benito returned to himself. His feet touched the ground again. He opened his eyes, blinking like someone waking from a deep sleep. He saw the monks watching him with awe and a touch of fear, and with his characteristic humility, he asked them not to say anything about what they had seen until after his death. He didn't want to be an object of admiration or curiosity. He didn't want people coming to see him as if he were an attraction. He simply wanted to be a servant of God, quietly doing his work. The monks vowed silence, though it was difficult for them. How can one remain silent about something so extraordinary? But they did, out of love and obedience to their abbot. Only after his death, when he could no longer be troubled by fame, did they recount what they had witnessed. Visions and prophecies, seeing the invisible. In those last months, Benito also had prophetic visions. The gift of seeing the future or knowing things that were happening in distant places, gifts he had occasionally displayed throughout his life, now seemed to intensify. Once, a bishop from a distant city came to visit Monte Cassino. He was a good but weak man, struggling with particular temptations. During his visit, he acted with perfect propriety, participating in prayers, eating in the refectory with the monks, and conversing piously on spiritual matters. But when he left, Benedict called together the monks who had served the bishop during his visit. "Brothers," he told them sadly, "pray for that bishop. Before long, he will fall into grave sin. I saw the darkness that surrounds him. I saw the enemy preparing a trap for him. Unless he is strengthened by prayer, he will fall." The monks prayed as Benedict had requested. But their prayers, though powerful, could not sway the bishop's will. The man had to choose, and sadly, he chose poorly. A few weeks later, news arrived that the bishop had been caught in adultery and had been deposed from his position in disgrace. The monks were amazed by Benedict's prophetic knowledge, but also saddened by the bishop's fall. Benedict reminded them, "This is not to make us feel superior. It is to teach us vigilance. Any one of us could fall in the same way if we rely on our own strength instead of God's grace. Always pray, lead us not into temptation." Once again, Benedict had a vision of the entire world. He was in his cell, praying in the dead of night. Suddenly, his cell was filled with brilliant light. Looking out the window, he saw something he could never adequately describe in words. He saw the whole world as if contained in a single ray of sunlight. He saw all the nations, all the cities, all the people, everything contained in that moment of divine vision. It wasn't that the world had shrunk, it was that his vision had expanded. For a moment, he saw as God sees, encompassing everything at once, past, present, and future, all simultaneously present to him. It was overwhelming, glorious, terrifying in its immensity. A monk named Servando, who was awake and passing near Benito's cell at that moment, heard Benito calling him. He went in and found Benito standing by the window, his face transfigured with wonder. "Servando, come quickly," said Benito. Look what God is showing me." Servando ran to the window, but by the time he arrived, the vision had passed. He saw only the ordinary night, the stars shining above, the dark hills below. But he saw Benito's face, and that was enough. He knew his abbot had witnessed something otherworldly. Later, Benito tried to explain to Servando what he had seen. "To the soul that sees the Creator," he said slowly, searching for words for the ineffable. "All of creation seems small, not because creation is less than it is, but because the soul that contemplates God sees all things in their true proportion. God is so infinitely great that, in comparison, even the whole world is small." Servando didn't fully understand. How could he? But he treasured the words in his heart. And years later, when he told this story, he could still see in his mind Benito's face illuminated by that celestial light. He could still hear the trembling voice of wonder with which he had spoken. These mystical experiences weren't just for Benito's benefit. They were preparation. God was preparing his servant for the final step, showing him glimpses of the world he would soon enter. Just as someone about to move to a new country might receive pictures or videos of the place, God was showing Benito the heaven that awaited him, making the transition from this life to the next less frightening, more desirable. The final 6 days, the countdown. 6 days before his death, Benedict ordered his monks to open his tomb. The instruction was clear and specific. "Open the tomb where my sister Scholastica rests," he said. "Prepare it, for I will soon join her there." The monks obeyed, though with heavy hearts. They knew what this meant. Their father, their teacher, their guide, would soon leave them. They opened the tomb with reverent care. Scholastica's body lay there, wrapped in white linen, at peace. They cleaned the tomb, preparing it for its new occupant. And from that moment, a kind of countdown began. The monks didn't say it aloud, but they all felt it. 6 days, 5 days, 4 days. Each day became more precious, each moment with Benedict more meaningful. Benedict continued his normal activities as much as he could. He led prayers, though his voice was weaker. He taught, though he had to sit more often. He received visitors, though the visits had to be shorter. He wanted to continue being the abbot, the father of his community, until the very end. But 4 days before his death, his body, finally gave out. He fell gravely ill with a high fever that left him weak and exhausted. The simple act of sitting required assistance. Walking was impossible. It was clear that the end was near. The monks wanted to take him to his cell, put him in his bed, make him comfortable. But Benedict had another request. "Take me to the chapel," he said in a weak but firm voice. "I want to be near the altar, near the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist during my last hours." So they carried him gently, 2 monks supporting him, almost carrying him. They placed him where he could see the altar, where the tabernacle held the Blessed Sacrament. And there he remained, praying constantly, his voice barely a whisper, but never ceasing. The monks kept a constant vigil. There were always several brothers in the chapel with him, also praying, ready to attend to his every need. They gave him sips of water when he was thirsty. They moistened his forehead when his fever raged. And above all, they prayed, their gentle voices interwoven with his in a tapestry of intercession. Benito prayed the psalms he had prayed thousands of times throughout his life. His memory, even as his body failed, retained those sacred words. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. Let everything that has breath praise the Lord." During these final 4 days, many came to say goodbye. Monks from the other monasteries he had founded, now led by abbots he had trained. People from the surrounding villages whose lives he had touched. Nobles who had supported his work. All wanted to see the saint one last time, to receive a final blessing. Benedict received them all, despite his extreme weakness. To each one he had something to say, some word of wisdom or comfort. To a young nervous abbot he said, "Do not fear. God will be with you, as he has been with me. Be faithful to the rule, and the rule will make you holy." To a weeping mother he said, "Your children are in God's hands. Trust in him." To a repentant sinner he said, "God's mercy is greater than all our sins. Go in peace." And he asked everyone, absolutely everyone, to pray. Not for himself, although he needed prayers too, but for the church, for the world, for peace. Prayer is the most important work, he reminded them with his last breath. Never stop praying. The death of the saint, a step towards glory. The 21st of March in the year 547 arrived. It was a beautiful day of early spring. The sun shone warmly after the cold of winter. The first green buds appeared on the trees. The birds sang with that particular joy they have in spring. It was the kind of day when life seems to celebrate itself, when the resurrection of nature proclaims the promise of eternal resurrection. Benito, though his body was dying, seemed more alive than ever spiritually. His face, ravaged by illness and age, shone with an inner light. His eyes, though physically weak, saw with extraordinary spiritual clarity. In the morning, he asked to receive Holy Communion. The monastery priest came with the Blessed Sacrament. The monks knelt around him as Benedict, helped to his seat, received the body and blood of Christ with profound devotion. Tears streamed down her aged face. They were tears of love, of gratitude, of anticipation. It was her last communion on this earth, the last sacrament she would receive before crossing the threshold. But she knew that soon she would be in the presence of Christ himself, not under the veils of the sacrament, but face to face, in all his glory. After receiving communion, Benedict asked his brothers to help him to his feet. He wanted to die as he had lived, in prayer. The monks, now openly weeping, supported him. His legs could not bear him, but the loving hands of his spiritual sons held him up. Benito raised his weak, trembling hands toward heaven, toward the altar, toward where he knew his true home was. And he began to pray aloud, his voice somehow stronger than it had been in days, as if all his remaining strength were focused on this final act of worship. Father! He prayed with the words of Christ on the cross, the words he had prayed countless times at the end of each day in Compline, but now with a final and definitive meaning. Into your hands I commit my spirit. And then, held by the loving hands of his brothers, with his last breath turned into prayer, with his eyes fixed on heaven, Benedict of Nursia died. The moment of his death was extraordinarily peaceful. There was no struggle, no agony. It was as if he had simply stepped from this world to the next, as naturally as one walks from one room to another. One moment he was there with them, the next he was with God. The monks later said that at the precise moment of his death, extraordinary things happened. The chapel was filled with a sweet fragrance, like incense, but more delicate, more heavenly. A light shone briefly, brighter than the sun streaming through the windows, and then vanished. And two monks, one in a distant monastery in the valley and the other on his way to Monte Cassino, had the same vision at the exact same moment. Both saw the heavens open. They saw a path or carpet of light crashing down from heaven to earth. On either side of the path were countless burning lamps shining like stars, and angels, choirs of angels, descending along that path. They saw Benedict's soul, bright and pure, being carried upward by angels. It ascended effortlessly, with evident joy, into the presence of God. The angels sang as they ascended, a song of triumph and welcome. And then the heavens closed, and the vision ended. When these two monks met later, having had no contact with each other, and shared their visions, they realized they had witnessed the same event from different locations. It was confirmation that their father, Benedict, had been received into glory, that he had completed his journey, that he had attained his reward, grief, and the immediate legacy. At Monte Cassino, the monks remained in the chapel with their father's body for a long time. They couldn't move. They didn't want to move. It was as if leaving the chapel would finally force them to admit that he was gone, and they weren't ready for that. They prayed, sang psalms, and wept. Their tears were of sorrow, yes. How could they not be? They had lost their father, their teacher, their guide. The monastery without Benedict seemed unthinkable, like a body without a soul. But their tears were also of gratitude. Gratitude for having known this holy man, for having been formed by him, for having received his example and his teachings. They prepared his body for burial with great care and reverence. They washed him, anointed him with perfumed oils, and wrapped him in clean white linen. Then they carried him in procession to the tomb he himself had prepared, the tomb where Scholastica already rested. The procession from the chapel to the tomb was solemn and beautiful. All the monks of the monastery participated, along with many people from the surrounding areas who had come upon hearing the news. They sang hymns of resurrection, not mournful songs of despair, for although they wept for the man's loss, they celebrated the saint's birth into heaven. "This is the day the Lord has made," they sang. "Hallelujah, hallelujah." Even in the midst of mourning there was joy, the Christian joy that knows that death is not the end, but the beginning. They placed Benedict's body in the tomb next to Scholastica. Brother and sister, twins in birth, twins in vocation, now together in death, awaiting the resurrection together, they sealed the tomb with a heavy stone slab, and there, in the heart of Monte Cassino, Benedict of Nursia rested. But even though the man had passed away, his work continued. The monks, after the initial period of mourning, returned to the rhythm of life that Benedict had established. The bells continued to ring for the hours of prayer. The monks continued to rise before dawn for lauds. They continued to work in the fields, copy manuscripts in the scriptorium, and receive guests at the guest house. Life went on because Benedict had established something greater than himself. And soon miracles began to happen at Benedict's tomb. Sick people who came to pray there were healed. Hardened sinners felt their hearts soften. The confused found clarity. The afflicted found comfort. It was as if Benedict, now in heaven, had even more power to help those who suffer than when he was on earth. News of these miracles spread. Pilgrims began to come to Monte Cassino, not only from Italy, but from all over Europe. They came to see the saint's tomb, to pray where he had prayed, to touch the stones of the monastery that his hands had touched. And Monte Cassino became one of the great pilgrimage centers of Christendom. But more important than the pilgrims was the fact that the rule of Benedict began to spread. Abbots of other monasteries, having heard of Benedict or having visited Monte Cassino, requested copies of the rule. They studied it, they adapted it to their own circumstances, and gradually, quietly, without fanfare or promotional campaigns, the rule of Saint Benedict became the standard for monastic life in the West. The tree that grew from the seed. The Benedictine legacy. In the centuries after Benedict's death, the life he had sown grew into a gigantic tree, whose branches spread throughout the known world. Benedictine monasteries multiplied across Europe like flowers in spring. In Italy, of course, where it had all begun, Monte Cassino remained the mother house, the place of origin, but hundreds of other Benedictine monasteries sprang up, each following the rule, each adapting to local circumstances, but maintaining the essential Benedictine spirit. In France, Benedictine monasteries flourished especially. They were established in the hills of Burgundy, in the valleys of Provence, and on the northern plains. Each became a beacon of light in regions that were often dark and dangerous. The monks drained unhealthy marshes and transformed them into fertile land. They built mills to grind grain, making life easier for the peasants. They taught improved farming techniques. And of course, they prayed without ceasing. In Spain, where Christians fought against the Muslim invasion, Benedictine monasteries were both spiritual and sometimes physical strongholds. They preserved the Christian faith in times of great danger. They copied manuscripts that would otherwise have been lost. They kept alive the hope that Spain would once again be Christian, as it eventually was. In Germany, Benedictine monasteries were crucial instruments of evangelization. Saint Boniface, the English monk who became the Apostle of Germany, established monasteries throughout the region. These monasteries not only preached the gospel, but also offered a visible alternative to paganism. The Germanic peoples could see a better, more peaceful, and more orderly way of life, and many were drawn to it. In England, following the mission of St. Augustine of Canterbury, Benedictine monasteries multiplied rapidly. They became the great centres of learning in the British Isles. In places like Lindisfarne, Jarrow, Canterbury, and Glastonbury, the monks not only prayed and worked, but also produced some of the most beautiful illuminated manuscripts the world has ever seen. Consider the Book of Kells, that spectacularly decorated gospel book now in Dublin. It was produced by monks, probably in Iona or Kells, working patiently for years or even decades. Every page is a masterpiece of art, with intricate illustrations in vibrant colours, with elaborate lettering that is itself a small work of art. Why did they go to so much trouble? Because they were copying the Word of God, and nothing was too beautiful, too meticulous, too precious for that task. In all these places, the Benedictine rhythm of ora et labora, prayer and work, created a way of life that was both contemplative and practical, heavenly and earthly, mystical and concrete. The monks prayed 7 times a day, yes, but between those prayers they worked hard. They cultivated fields, raised livestock, made cheese and beer, built structures, copied books, taught children, and cared for the sick. And in this work, they dignified labour itself. In a society where manual labour was often looked down upon, considered only for slaves or peasants, the Benedictine monks showed that work was noble. Saint Benedict himself had worked with his hands. Benedictine abbots worked alongside their monks. There was no division between those who thought and those who worked. Everyone did both. This was one of Benedict's greatest gifts to Western civilization, the dignity of work. He helped create a culture where work, far from being a curse, was seen as a vocation, a way of participating in God's creative work. Monasteries as preservers of civilization. But perhaps the most important contribution of the Benedictine monasteries was the preservation of knowledge during what is sometimes called the Dark Ages. When the Roman Empire fell, when barbarian invasions swept across Europe, when civilization seemed to be collapsing, the monasteries kept the light of learning burning. Imagine a Benedictine scriptorium in the 8th century. It is winter, and the cold is biting even inside the monastery. The scribe sits at his slanted desk, wrapped in woolen blankets, his fingers numb despite the fingerless gloves he wears. Before him lies an ancient manuscript, its parchment pages yellowed and brittle with age. It is a copy of the works of Virgil, the great Roman poet who lived 800 years earlier. The monk copies the text with meticulous care. Every letter must be perfect. A single mistake could be perpetuated through generations, distorting the original text. He uses a quill pen, precisely cut and sharpened. The ink is made in the monastery itself from gallnuts and iron sulfate, mixed with gum arabic for the correct consistency. It's tedious, exhausting work. Your eyes tire from focusing on the text. Your back aches from hunching over the desk. Your fingers cramp from holding the pen. Page after page, hour after hour, day after day. A complete manuscript could take months or even years of work. Why does he do it? Why would a Christian monk carefully copy the works of a pagan poet? Because the Benedictines believed that all truth comes from God. If Virgil wrote true and beautiful things about the human condition, about love and loss, about heroism and sacrifice, then those truths ultimately came from God, even if Virgil himself didn't know it. And those truths deserve to be preserved. Thus, in the scriptoria of Benedictine monasteries, not only the scriptures and the writings of the Church Fathers were copied, but also the classics of Greco-Roman literature. Homer and Plato, Aristotle and Cicero, Virgil and Ovid, all survived the Dark Ages because patient monks copied them by hand. Without the quiet, unglamorous work of the Benedictine scribes, much of ancient literature and philosophy would have been lost forever. The Renaissance, which was based on the rediscovery of the classics, would not have been possible. Western civilization, as we know it, would be fundamentally different. And they didn't just copy the texts, they studied them, they commented on them, they discussed them. Benedictine monasteries became centers of learning. They had libraries that were treasures of knowledge in an age when books were rare and precious. They had schools where not only theology was taught, but also the liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. The Venerable Bede, that great 8th century English Benedictine monk, never travelled beyond his monastery at Jarrow. But from that remote place in northern England, he wrote works of history, theology, and natural science that were studied throughout Europe. His ecclesiastical history of the English people remains our primary source for the early history of England. And he did all this while living faithfully according to the rule of Saint Benedict, balancing his study with prayer and manual labour. Saints of the Benedictine family and the saints. Oh, the saints who emerged from the Benedictine life. We cannot name them all, there would be thousands. But let us mention a few who shine with particular light. Saint Gregory the Great, whom we have already discussed, was the Pope who wrote Benedict's biography. He himself was a Benedictine monk before becoming Pope, and he strove to maintain the Benedictine spirit, even amidst the overwhelming responsibilities of the papacy. He reformed the liturgy, reorganized the administration of the Church, sent missionaries to England, and wrote theological and pastoral works that are still read today. And all of this was rooted in his Benedictine formation. St. Augustine of Canterbury, who brought the faith to England, arrived fearful and uncertain of his mission. But armed with the rule of Benedict and the blessing of Pope Gregory, he persevered. He established the monastery of Canterbury, which became the heart of the English Church. Thousands, eventually millions, were converted to Christianity through his work. St. Boniface, the Apostle of Germany, was an English monk, educated in Benedictine monasteries. He felt called to bring the gospel to the pagan Germanic tribes. He crossed the English Channel and spent decades evangelizing, establishing monasteries and ordaining priests. He was eventually martyred, killed by pagans who resisted his message. But his blood became the seed of the church in Germany. St. Hildegard of Bingen, that extraordinary 12th century nun. She was a mystic, experiencing visions from childhood. But she was not only a dreamer, she was also a scientist, writing treatises on medicine and botany. She was a composer, creating music of ethereal beauty that is still performed today. She was an advisor to popes and emperors. She was an abbess, leading her convent with wisdom and firmness. All this while living as a Benedictine nun, following the rule, balancing contemplation with action. Saint Anselm of Canterbury, the great theologian and philosopher, his ontological argument for the existence of God is still debated by philosophers today. His book, Why God Became Man, is a classic of theology. But before becoming Archbishop of Canterbury, before becoming a famous theologian, he was simply a Benedictine monk at the Abbey of Bec in Normandy, living according to the rule. We could go on. Saint Peter Damian, the Reformer. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian. Saint Thomas Becket, martyr. Saint Gertrude the Great, mystic. Blessed John, Duns Scotus, philosopher. The list is endless, and for every famous saint whose name we know, there were hundreds, thousands of ordinary Benedictines who lived lives of quiet holiness. Monks who never wrote a book, never had a dramatic vision, were never consulted by kings, but who faithfully, day after day, year after year, prayed and worked, followed the rule, and loved God and neighbour. They too are saints, known to God if not to history, benito, in the modern world. And now, dear friends, we come to our own time. What does Saint Benedict mean for us today, in the 21st century, 1500 years after his death? We might think that a 6th century monk would have little to tell us. After all, we live in such a different world from his. We have technology he could never have imagined. We live in democracies, not barbarian kingdoms. Most of us aren't monks, and we don't want to be. But the truth is that Benedict's message is surprisingly, even urgently, relevant to our time, perhaps more relevant than ever. We live in an age of constant noise. Our phones buzz with notifications. Our screens flicker with images. Our world is noisy, busy, frantic. And amidst all this noise, we lose something essential. We lose the silence where the soul can breathe. Benedict invites us to silence, not the silence of death, but the silence of profound life. The silence where we can hear the whispers of God, where we can know our own hearts, where we can find peace. Benedictine monasteries still exist today, hundreds of them around the world. And one of the most valuable things they offer is precisely this gift of silence. People come in retreat, fleeing the noise of their busy lives, and find in the silence of the monastery something they didn't know they desperately needed. We also live in an age of frenetic activity. There's always something else to do. We're always busy. We're always rushing. And we get exhausted. We burn out. We lose sight of why we're doing what we're doing. Benedict invites us to balance. Ora et labora, prayer and work. Not just work without prayer, for that leads to exhaustion and emptiness. Not just prayer without work, for that leads to escapism and irrelevance. But both together, in a healthy rhythm, each nourishing the other. How would we incorporate this balance into our lives? Perhaps by beginning and ending each day with prayer, however brief. Perhaps by taking breaks throughout the day to return to our center, to remember God's presence. Perhaps by establishing a true day of rest each week, a Sabbath where we leave work behind and simply be. We live in an age of superficial connection. We have hundreds of friends on social media, yet we often feel profoundly alone. We constantly have conversations, but we rarely communicate anything truly meaningful or deep. Benedict invites us to genuine community. The Benedictine monastery is not a collection of individuals living side by side. It is a true family where people know each other deeply, where they are committed to one another, where they stay together through difficulties and not just when it is easy or convenient. What would this look like in our lives? Perhaps by investing more deeply in a few relationships instead of maintaining many superficial ones. Perhaps by committing to a community, a church, a group, and staying there even when it's difficult. Perhaps by choosing depth over breadth in our relationships. We live in an age of constant self-promotion. We are told that we must promote our personal brand, that we must project confidence, that we must be our own biggest advocate. Benedict invites us to humility, not the false humility that pretends to have no gifts, but the true humility that recognizes that all the good in us comes from God, that we are dependent creatures, that we need God and others. What would practicing this humility look like? Perhaps by being quicker to admit when we're wrong. Perhaps by being more willing to ask for help when we need it. Perhaps by being genuinely happy for the success of others instead of feeling envious. We live in an age of endless options and minimal commitments. We can always change jobs, change cities, change relationships, change churches. And while mobility and freedom are valuable, there is also a loss. We lose the deep roots that only come from staying put. Benedict invites us to stability. Benedictine stability is not about being stuck in a bad situation. It is the commitment to remain where God has planted us, to put down deep roots, to work through difficulties instead of running away from them. What would this look like for us? Perhaps by staying in a job or vocation even when it loses its initial novelty. Perhaps by working through conflicts in relationships instead of simply abandoning them. Perhaps by committing to a place, a community, and allowing that commitment to shape us. A personal invitation. Experience the Benedictine spirit. And now, dear friends, as our long night together draws to a close, I want to extend a personal invitation. I am not asking you to become Benedictine monks, although if you feel that calling, how wonderful that would be. But I am inviting you to something that everyone can do. Experiment with incorporating elements of the Benedictine spirit into your own lives. Here are some concrete and practical suggestions. First, experiment with the rhythm of prayer. You don't have to pray 7 times a day like monks, but what if you started with 2 moments of prayer each day? 5 minutes in the morning when you wake up, before checking your phone or turning on your computer. Simply being still before God, perhaps reading a psalm, perhaps simply sitting in mindful silence. And 5 minutes at night before going to sleep, surrendering the day to God, giving thanks for blessings, asking forgiveness for shortcomings, trusting in His care during the night. See what happens if you do this faithfully for a month. See if you notice a change in yourselves, a peace that gradually grows, an awareness of God that was there all along but that you hadn't noticed in the noise of life. Second, experiment with silence. We live in a world of constant noise. When was the last time you experienced true silence? Try this. For 1 week, set aside 30 minutes each day for silence. Turn off all devices. Don't play music. Don't read. Just be still. Sit in a comfortable chair or go for a walk, but without headphones, without podcasts, just silence. At first, it will be uncomfortable. Your mind will race with 1,000 thoughts. You will want to fill the silence, but persevere. Gradually, the silence will become more comfortable, and you will begin to hear things that the noise had been drowning out. Your own inner voice, the voice of God, the whispers of the Spirit. Third, experiment with work-life balance. Modern culture tends to glorify overwork. We work long hours, take work home, constantly check emails, and never truly rest. Benito shows us a better way. Try this. Set clear boundaries around work. When it's time to work, work intensely and with focus. But when work time is over, stop. Really stop. Turn off your computer, silence your phone, and be present with your family or friends. Or if you're alone, be present with yourself, with God, with the beauty of creation. And take a true Sabbath every week, a full day from sunset one day to sunset the next, where you don't work. No emails, no to-dos, no projects. Rest, pray, play, enjoy, celebrate. Trust that God can take care of the world for 24 hours while you rest. Fourth, experiment with manual labor. If your work is primarily mental or screen-based, find some way to work with your hands. Grow a garden, even a small one, even if it's just a few pots of herbs on a windowsill. Cook a meal from scratch instead of buying something ready-made. Do some home repairs instead of always hiring someone. Learn a craft. Knitting, woodworking, pottery, whatever appeals to you. There is something deeply satisfying about manual work. It connects us to the materiality of creation. It allows us to see concrete results of our efforts. It balances us when we spend too much time in our heads. Fifth, experiment with hospitality. In your next week, look for an opportunity to practice Benedictine hospitality. Invite someone over for a meal. It doesn't have to be elaborate. Remember, monks eat simply. What matters is the connection, not the impression. Or if you can't invite someone into your home, find other ways to show hospitality. Smile at the stranger on the street. Be patient with the cashier at the store. Offer your seat on the bus. Really listen when someone speaks to you, giving them your full attention. These are all forms of hospitality, ways of treating others like Christ. Sixth, experiment with humility. This is perhaps the most difficult because it goes against everything our culture tells us. But try this for a week. Every time you feel the urge to promote yourself, defend yourself, or make sure others recognize your merits, stop, breathe, let the moment pass. I'm not saying never to talk about your accomplishments or to let others take advantage of you, but practice not needing to always be the center of attention, not needing everyone to know how good you are. Practice the humble stillness that trusts that God sees, God knows, and that is enough. And finally, seventh if possible, visit a Benedictine monastery. Many monasteries offer retreat programs for lay people. You can go for a day, a weekend, or longer. Participate in prayers with the monks, eat the simple meals, walk around the grounds, talk to a monk if you have the opportunity, experience the Benedictine rhythm in action. You don't have to do all these things at once. Choose one or two that resonate with you most and start there. The important thing is not to be perfect, but to begin. As Benedict wrote at the end of his rule, "This little rule for beginners is only a beginning, but it is a beginning towards something beautiful, toward a more balanced, more peaceful life, more rooted in God." The closing, peace in rest. And now, dear friends, it is truly, finally, time to rest. We have traveled together tonight across centuries and continents. We have met an extraordinary man who lived 1500 years ago, but whose life still speaks to us with power. We have seen Benedict as a child in Nursia, as a young man in Rome fleeing decadence. We have followed him to his cave in Subiaco, where he spent 3 years in solitude with God. We have witnessed the growth of the 12 monasteries. We have heard the wisdom of his teachings. We have travelled with him to Monte Cassino. We have seen the foundation of the great monastery that would become a beacon of light for Europe. We have read the words of his rule, that perennial wisdom that balances prayer and work, discipline and mercy, the individual and the community. We have known Scholastica, his twin sister, and witnessed their final encounter when the storm of prayer halted his departure. We have been present in spirit when Benedict died, supported by his brothers, his last breath transformed into prayer. And we have seen the legacy flourishing through the centuries. Monasteries all over Europe, countless saints, knowledge preserved, civilization maintained, and through it all, the constant rhythm of ora et labora, prayer and work, keeping the world anchored in the eternal. What do we take away from all this? Hope, I think. Hope that in the midst of chaos, it's possible to find order. In the midst of noise, it's possible to find silence. In the midst of superficiality, it's possible to find depth. In the midst of individualism, it's possible to find genuine community. And in the midst of it all, always, the possibility of finding God. Benito wasn't a superhero. He was a man with the same temptations, the same weaknesses we all have, but he chose to seek God above all else. And in that search, he found not only God, but also his true self. He found peace, purpose, and a joy the world cannot give. And what he found, we too can find. We don't have to be monks. We don't have to live in caves or monasteries. But we can incorporate the Benedictine spirit into our ordinary lives. And in doing so, we can transform those ordinary lives into something extraordinary. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine one last time that you are in that Benedictine monastery. You have sung Compline, the last prayer of the day. The great silence has descended. You walk slowly through the cloister toward your cell. The moon shines in the central courtyard. The stars twinkle above. All is peaceful. They enter their simple cell. They lie down on the narrow but comfortable bed. And as they close their eyes, they hear the final words of Compline echoing in their memory. Into your hands I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, Lord, God of truth. In your hands, not trying to control, to plan, to worry. Simply letting go, trusting, resting, like a child falling asleep in its father's arms, completely safe, completely loved. May the example of Saint Benedict inspire you to seek that balance in your own lives. May his rule guide you toward a wiser and holier way of living. May his peace fill your hearts. May his love for God ignite love in your own souls. Sleep well, dear friends. Sleep soundly. Sleep in the peace that surpasses all understanding, and when you wake up tomorrow, wake up with gratitude, with hope, with the desire to live this new day as a gift from God. Saint Benedict of Nursia, father of Western monasticism, teacher of generations, example of balanced and practical holiness, pray for us. Help us to find the sacred rhythm of prayer and work. Help us to value silence. Help us to build genuine community. Help us to be humble. Help us to remain faithful. And above all, help us to seek God with all our heart, as you did. Good night. May God bless you. May God hold you in the palm of his hand. May his angels encamp around you while you sleep. And may you awaken refreshed, ready to live another day in God's presence. And if this journey with Saint Benedict has brought you peace, if it has helped you sleep better, if it has inspired you to seek a more balanced, more contemplative life, more rooted in the eternal, then please consider doing two things. First, please like this video and subscribe to Saints to Sleep. There are so many more saints whose stories I want to share with you. Saints from all eras, all places, and all walks of life. But they all have one thing in common. They sought God with all their hearts, and in him they found what we all seek. And second, share this video with someone you know who might need to hear about Saint Benedict, someone who is stressed, who is searching for balance, who is hungry for something deeper than what the world offers. Share this gift of peace with them. Until next time, my friends, may you walk in the peace of Christ. May you live in the balance of Benedict. May you find God in silence and in work, in community and in solitude, in every moment of every day. Good night, sweet dreams, and may Saint Benedict bless you from heaven. Amen.